The Empire of Vareth did not worship mercy. It worshipped permanence. King Vaelor Draven had crushed 3 rebellions by 30, forged an empire through campaigns so merciless that enemies whispered his name like a curse. Then he chose Seris Vale, a forgotten daughter from a dying house, as his queen. The court called it weakness. Vaelor called it bait, because someone inside his palace was preparing to destroy him, and survival demanded sacrifices no one could see coming. Stick around until the end of this story, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments so I know my tribe is watching. This is how empires break and kings learn what it costs to rule. The marriage announcement came during the Winter Accord, when the imperial capital of Aster Vale drowned beneath false smiles and jeweled daggers disguised as compliments. Vaelor Draven stood beneath the Hall of Suns, black armor replaced by ceremonial robes that felt like burial shrouds against his skin. The crown sat heavy on his head, gold twisted with iron, a weight he had earned through blood rather than birthright. Around him, lesser houses gathered like carrion birds pretending to be peacocks, their perfumes failing to mask the stench of ambition. Grand Chancellor Mordrin Voss watched from the raised platform, silver robes catching torchlight, his face carved from patience and calculation. The man smiled like a knife learning to speak. Vaelor's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. I have chosen a queen. Silence fell like an executioner's blade. The nobles leaned forward, expecting a name that made sense. A princess from the eastern reaches. An heiress from House Blackmore with armies and gold. Someone who brought power to power, as empires had always demanded. Seris Vale of House Valecrest. The hall erupted into chaos barely disguised as celebration. Vaelor saw it all. The widened eyes. The exchanged glances that carried entire conversations. The way Mordrin's smile tightened at the corners, a fracture in carefully maintained composure, because Seris Vale was nobody. House Valecrest had been significant once, 3 generations back, before poor investments and poorer marriages reduced them to ornamental presence at court. They owned land that produced nothing valuable. Their military contribution consisted of 30 aging soldiers who drank more than they trained. Their daughter had been educated well enough to avoid embarrassment, but possessed no political leverage worth mentioning. The court saw weakness. Vaelor saw exactly what he needed. Later that night, after the feast had dissolved into drunken revelry and false congratulations, Vaelor found Seris standing alone on the eastern balcony overlooking the city. Aster Vale sprawled beneath them like a beast sleeping fitfully, torches marking streets that never truly rested. She did not turn when his boots struck marble. "You're wondering why," she said. Her voice carried no inflection, no hope, no gratitude, just observation delivered like a blade testing armor for weakness. Vaelor moved beside her, close enough that servants watching from shadowed doorways would report intimacy, far enough that truth remained between them. "I'm wondering if you understand," he replied. Seris finally looked at him. Moonlight carved her face into angles and shadows. She was not beautiful in the way court painters immortalized queens. Her beauty was structural, the kind built from intelligence that learned early how to survive without protection. "You need someone the court will not see coming," she said. "Someone they will dismiss. Someone expendable enough that if this is a trap, you lose nothing that matters." Vaelor felt something unfamiliar move through his chest. Not affection, recognition. "And you accept it anyway." She smiled, and the expression carried no warmth. "I have spent 22 years being dismissed at court, Your Majesty. I learned long ago that invisibility is its own kind of armor. You are offering me visibility. That makes me either fortunate or dead. Which do you prefer?" "I prefer survival, but I will settle for purpose." The wind shifted, carrying smoke from the forges that never stopped feeding the Empire's appetite for weapons. Vaelor studied her profile. The way she watched the city like a general surveying territory, rather than a bride admiring her new home. "Someone is moving against me," he said quietly. "From inside the palace. They are patient, intelligent. They understand how power flows through Aster Vale better than most of my generals understand warfare." Seris nodded slowly. "And you believe marrying me will draw them out? I believe you will notice things that soldiers miss. I believe the court will ignore you long enough for you to become useful, and I believe that whoever wants my throne will make mistakes trying to understand why I chose you. What if they simply kill me? Then I will know who they are, Vaelor said, and I will kill them slowly enough that the memory outlives their bloodline. The brutality of it should have frightened her. Instead, Seris laughed, a sound like breaking glass wrapped in silk. You are honest about my value. I appreciate that. Vaelor turned to face her fully. Up close, he could see the faint scar along her jawline, poorly hidden beneath powder. A childhood injury, perhaps, or something more recent. Evidence that she knew violence already. This empire respects nothing except strength, he said. Not mercy, not fairness, certainly not love. If you survive long enough to become queen in truth rather than title, you will need to be harder than stone and sharper than winter. And if I fail, then you die. Just like everyone else who underestimates what it costs to stand beside power. Seris held his gaze without flinching. I have been dying slowly my entire life, Your Majesty. At least this way I die doing something that matters. The wedding occurred 3 weeks later under skies threatening snow. The ceremony unfolded inside the Cathedral of Eternal Rain, a monument to imperial permanence built from black marble veined with gold. Stained glass windows depicted conquests and coronations, battles frozen in colored light, saints and soldiers bleeding together into myth. Vaelor stood at the altar in full ceremonial armor, the black crown replaced temporarily by a circlet of silver thorns. Beside him, Mordrin Voss presided with the authority granted to Grand Chancellors since the Empire's founding. The old man's voice filled the cathedral like smoke. Power is given by the Empire and sustained through the Empire. A king rules not for himself but for the permanence of the realm. Standard rhetoric, expected platitudes. But Vaelor heard the message beneath the words. You are temporary. The throne is eternal, and I speak for the throne. Seris entered through bronze doors that required 6 men to open. She wore white silk embroidered with silver thread, traditional and unremarkable. No crown yet, no jewelry beyond a simple pendant bearing House Valecrest's faded crest. She walked alone. Her father had died years ago. Her mother remained in their country estate, too ill to travel. No brothers, no sisters. Just Seris moving through candlelight toward a throne she had never imagined touching. The court watched her like predators evaluating prey. Vaelor watched them watching her. When she reached the altar, their eyes met. For just a moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with politics. Understanding, maybe. Or mutual recognition of the trap they had both chosen to enter. Mordrin continued the rites with practiced efficiency. The exchange of vows. The binding of hands with silk cord dyed imperial crimson. The presentation of the queen's circlet, a delicate thing of white gold and sapphires that looked fragile compared to Vaelor's crown of black iron. Seris knelt. Vaelor placed the circlet on her head with hands that had strangled enemies and signed execution orders. Rise, Queen Seris, he said. First of your name, last of your house, bound to the Empire until death claims its due. She stood. The cathedral erupted into applause that sounded like distant thunder. They were married. The Empire had a new queen. And Mordrin Voss smiled like a man watching pieces fall exactly where he wanted them. The wedding feast stretched into the early hours of morning. Inside the grand hall, nobles gorged themselves on roasted meats and imported wines, while musicians played compositions designed to project celebration rather than inspire it. Conversation flowed like poison mixed with honey, sweet on the surface and lethal underneath. Vaelor sat at the head table with Seris beside him, both playing their roles with the precision of soldiers following battle plans. She smiled when appropriate, accepted congratulations with gracious brevity, deflected questions about heirs and alliances with practiced neutrality. But Vaelor noticed what others missed, the way her eyes tracked movement across the hall, the slight tension in her shoulders when certain nobles approached, the careful notes she seemed to be taking mentally, cataloging faces and names and the invisible currents of power that connected them. She was learning the battlefield. Lord Corvin Ashmar approached, a bloated administrator who controlled grain distribution across the northern provinces. He bowed with exaggerated deference, wine sloshing from his goblet. Your Majesty, Your Grace, a union blessed by fortune itself. Vaelor nodded without warmth. Lord Ashmar's smile widened, revealing teeth stained purple. I merely hope the new queen understands the complexities of imperial governance. So many moving parts, so many traditions. It can be overwhelming for those unaccustomed to such responsibility. The insult landed soft as silk and sharp as broken glass. Seris's expression did not change. I appreciate your concern, Lord Ashmar, though I suspect anyone who has survived court politics without wealth or army has already learned more about complexity than most men learn with both. The surrounding nobles froze. Ashmar's smile cracked. Vaelor felt something dangerous and unexpected move through his chest. Respect. The feast continued. More nobles approached with congratulations that barely concealed curiosity or contempt. Each time, Seris deflected with intelligence instead of charm, observation instead of flattery. She was refusing to play the game they expected. Near midnight, Vaelor found Mordrin Voss standing near the windows overlooking the palace gardens. The Grand Chancellor held a glass of wine he had not touched, his attention focused on something beyond the celebration. An interesting choice, Mordrin said without turning. Unexpected. Most of my choices are, Vaelor replied. Mordrin finally looked at him. The old man's eyes were colorless in the dim light, like ice reflecting nothing. The council worries about stability. House Valecrest brings no alliances, no military strength. In times of uncertainty, the Empire requires foundations built from more than sentiment. I did not choose sentiment. I chose someone the Empire underestimates. Mordrin's smile was a wound trying to heal. And what happens when our enemies exploit that underestimation? When they see weakness where you see strategy? Then they make mistakes, Vaelor said quietly. And mistakes create opportunities. For a long moment, the two men stood in silence while music and laughter filled the spaces between them. Finally, Mordrin raised his untouched wine. To the queen, may she prove more resilient than her house. He drank. Vaelor did not. The first real conversation happened 3 nights after the wedding. Vaelor found Seris in the archives of lineage, a library buried deep within the palace that housed genealogies and historical records dating back centuries. Most nobles never visited. The information was considered dull, the atmosphere suffocating with dust and old paper. Seris sat at a reading table surrounded by open volumes, candlelight casting shadows across pages filled with names and dates and the mathematical decay of bloodlines. She did not look up when he entered. Looking for inspiration? Vaelor asked. Looking for patterns, she replied. Your empire keeps meticulous records: birth, death, marriage, rebellion, execution, all documented with impressive precision. Vaelor moved closer. The book spread across the table detailed noble houses stretching back generations, their rises and falls marked in careful script. And what patterns have you found? Seris finally looked at him. Exhaustion shadowed her face, but her eyes remained sharp. The houses that survive are not the strongest. They are the ones that adapt, the ones that recognize when power shifts before anyone else notices, the ones that sacrifice pride for position. She gestured to an open page. House Mordrin, for example. 5 generations ago, they were minor administrators. Now the Grand Chancellor controls more daily operations than you do. How did that happen? Competence, Vaelor said. Seris shook her head. Patience. The Mordrins never grabbed for power. They accumulated it, one careful appointment at a time, one royal favor exchanged for another. They built themselves into the foundation of the empire so thoroughly that removing them would require tearing down the structure itself. Vaelor felt the implications settle like frost. You think Mordrin is moving against me? Arias. I think Mordrin is the only person in this palace who does not need to move against you. He already owns half the empire through proxy and influence. If you died tomorrow, he would not need to seize power. He would simply continue administering it while some figurehead wore your crown. Then why would he arrange instability? Seris closed the book in front of her with deliberate care. Because you are too strong. As long as you live, there is always the possibility that you will recognize how much power you have already surrendered to bureaucracy. A weakened king is manageable. A paranoid king making erratic decisions is better. And a dead king is best of all, provided his death looks natural or justified. Vaelor sat down across from her. The archive felt suddenly smaller, the shadows heavier. You are saying the rebellion is orchestrated. I am saying that rebellion is convenient. Lord Caedron Sol is descended from a branch of the royal family that your grandfather exiled. He has legitimate grievances and enough charisma to attract followers. If someone wanted to destabilize your rule without leaving fingerprints, supporting Kadrin would be obvious. And you determined this from reading genealogies? Seris smiled without humor. I determined this from watching Mordrin's face when you announced our marriage. He was surprised. Genuinely surprised. Men like him are surprised only when their plans encounter something they did not anticipate. Silence filled the archive. Outside, the palace continued its endless performance. Guards changed shifts. Servants prepared rooms for sleep. Nobles conspired behind closed doors while pretending loyalty in public halls. Inside the archive, a king and a queen. Nobody wanted studied the mathematics of survival. Finally, Vaelor spoke. If you are right, we are surrounded by enemies we cannot identify. If I am right, Seris corrected, we are surrounded by one very intelligent enemy with many unknowing tools. The trick is not identifying all the tools. It is identifying the hand that wields them. And how do we do that? We watch. We listen. And we make them think we are too distracted by rebellion and new marriage to notice the knife being sharpened in our own palace. Vaelor studied her face in the candlelight. This woman the court dismissed as insignificant. This forgotten daughter from a dying house who read genealogies like battle plans and spoke treason like philosophy. You are not what I expected, he said quietly. Seris met his gaze without flinching. Neither are you, Your Majesty. I expected a tyrant. Instead, I found a man intelligent enough to be terrified. I am not terrified. Everyone with real power is terrified. The difference is whether you admit it or whether you let fear make you stupid. The archive fell silent again. Then Seris stood, smoothing her dress with practiced efficiency. I should return to my chambers. Queens are expected to sleep in silk and wake to servants rather than spend nights reading about dead houses in dusty libraries. Vaelor remained seated. The servants will gossip if we are not seen together. Let them gossip. Gossip is noise. Noise obscures signal, and right now we need our enemies hearing noise while we search for signal. She moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Your Majesty. When you crushed the Northern Rebellion 5 years ago, you executed Lord Garrett Thorne and his 3 sons, but the records show he had a daughter. Where is she now? Vaelor felt ice move through his veins. I do not know. She disappeared after the executions. Why? Seris's expression revealed nothing. Because people who disappear either die quietly or wait for revenge. And I suspect Mordrin is the type of man who collects useful people the way other men collect gold. She left without waiting for response. Vaelor sat alone in the archive, surrounded by books documenting the rise and fall of houses that had once seemed eternal. For the first time in years, he felt the ground shifting beneath his throne. The rebellion escalated with surgical precision. Reports arrived daily from the southern territories. Villages declaring for Lord Kadrin's soul. Imperial garrisons surrendering without battle. Supply lines disrupted. Tax collectors murdered on roads that had been safe for generations. Kadrin fought like a man educated in imperial strategy, which made sense given his bloodline. But he moved with intelligence that suggested current information rather than historical knowledge. Someone was feeding him details, troop movements, treasury allocations, the locations of weapons stockpiles, information that should have been impossible to access. Vaelor Draven were councils that stretched deep into night. Generals argued over response strategies while maps of the empire transformed into abstractions marked with colored pins representing armies and allegiances. But Vaelor's attention kept drifting toward the council members themselves. Mordrin attended every meeting, offered suggestions with calm rationality, provided historical context about previous rebellions and how they had been resolved. Helpful, competent, indispensable, exactly as Seris had predicted. During one particularly heated session, General Cade Theron pounded the table with a fist like a hammer striking iron. We need to march south immediately. Crush this rebellion before it spreads further. Every day we delay costs us territory and respect. Vaelor studied the map without responding. Mordrin intervened smoothly. General Theron's passion is understandable. However, hasty military response has historically proven costly. The southern reaches favor defensive terrain. Lord Kadrin will lead us into ambushes if we pursue aggressively. Better to consolidate our position, fortify supply lines, and force him to overextend. Theron's face darkened. Consolidation is coward's language. We are the Empire. We do not hide behind fortifications. Mordrin's smile never wavered. The Empire has endured for 3 centuries precisely because it does not confuse pride with strategy. Vaelor raised a hand. Silence fell immediately. We march in 2 weeks. General Theron will command the vanguard. Chancellor Voss will oversee logistics and supply coordination from Aster Vale. Mordrin's expression flickered. Just for a moment. A Kraken carefully maintained composure. Your Majesty, my presence on the campaign might prove valuable. I have studied historical rebellions extensively and could provide counsel in real time. Vaelor met his gaze without emotion. Your value is precisely why you remain here. If something happens to me, the Empire needs competent leadership maintaining order. The Council depends on your guidance. The flattery landed like a blade wrapped in silk. Mordrin had no choice except to accept. After the Council disbanded, Vaelor found Seris waiting in his private chambers. She stood near the window watching night settle over Aster Vale like ash after fire. You are leaving, she said without turning. In 2 weeks. And you expect me to remain here, vulnerable, exposed to whatever Mordrin has planned. Vaelor moved beside her. Below, the city glittered with torchlight and lantern glow, beauty that concealed endless violence. I expect you to do what you do best. Watch. Listen. Notice things that soldiers miss. Seris finally looked at him. Anger sharpened her features. You are using me as bait. I told you that from the beginning. Telling me and leaving me defenseless are different things. Vaelor felt something unfamiliar move through him. Not quite guilt, not quite concern. Something unnamed that lived between strategy and humanity. You are not defenseless. You are intelligent. That makes you more dangerous than most of my generals. Intelligence does not stop poison. It does not prevent assassins. It does not protect against enemies I cannot see. The rawness in her voice cut through his armor. For a moment they stood in silence while the city breathed below them. Then Vaelor did something he had not done since his first wife died years ago. He reached out and touched her hand. The contact was brief, awkward, unpracticed, but real. I will leave you Captain Ryden Corps and 20 of my personal guard, men who answer to no one except me. They will not prevent everything, but they will make assassination expensive enough to reconsider. Seris stared at their hands, his scarred fingers against her unmarked skin. Why? She asked quietly. If I die, you lose nothing important. You said so yourself. Vaelor withdrew his hand but held her gaze. I was wrong. You have become useful, and I protect things that are useful. The words were brutal in their honesty. But somehow, in the twisted logic of empires and survival, they felt like the closest thing to tenderness either of them knew how to offer. Seris's expression softened slightly. When you crush this rebellion, come back alive. Queens who lose their kings rarely survive the transition. When I crush this rebellion, I will return with answers, and then we will deal with whoever has been trying to destroy us from inside. They stood together watching the city until moonlight replaced torchlight and exhaustion finally claimed them both. The night before Vaelor's departure, Seris hosted her first official court function. The moonlight reception was a tradition dating back generations, an opportunity for the queen to demonstrate her social competence and build relationships with noble houses. Most queens used it to accumulate allies. Seris used it to study enemies. The grand hall glittered with calculated extravagance. Chandeliers the size of horses hung from vaulted ceilings. Musicians played compositions that cost more than most families earned in years. Servants circulated with wine and delicacies, while nobles performed their endless dance of status and manipulation. Seris stood at the center wearing midnight blue silk embroidered with silver stars, the queen's circlet catching candlelight. She smiled with practiced warmth and spoke with careful neutrality. But her eyes never stopped moving. She noticed Lord Ashmar speaking quietly with 3 other northern administrators, their conversation dying the moment she approached. She noticed Lady Mira Thorne wearing black mourning silk, the daughter Vaelor had mentioned, the ghost who had supposedly disappeared. She noticed Mordrin Voss watching everything from the shadows, his face carved from patience. The reception unfolded with exhausting predictability, compliments that barely concealed contempt. Questions about Vaelor's campaign disguised as concern. Subtle probing about her influence and intentions. Near midnight, Mordrin approached with 2 glasses of wine. "A spectacular evening, Your Grace. You have demonstrated remarkable composure." Seris accepted the wine but did not drink. Composure is easy when expectations are low. Mordrin's smile was surgical. "The court has been unkind in their assessment. That will change with time. Or it will not, and I will adapt regardless." They stood in silence while music played and nobles danced with choreographed precision. Finally, Mordrin spoke again. "The king trusts you. That is unusual for him. Trust is expensive. I suspect he trusts very few people." Wise. Trust creates vulnerability. And vulnerability is dangerous for men with crowns. Seris met his colorless gaze. "Dangerous for everyone, Chancellor, not just kings." Mordrin raised his glass. "To survival, then. The only currency that truly matters." He drank. Seris watched him carefully, then lifted her own glass and sipped. The wine was excellent, imported from vineyards 300 miles south. Sweet with just enough bitterness to remind the drinker that pleasure and poison often share the same cup. She set the glass down without finishing. Hours later, after the reception ended and nobles dispersed into the night, Seris returned to her chambers. Captain Ryden Kor stood outside her door, a man carved from scar tissue and competence. He had served Vaelor for 15 years, survived 6 major battles, and possessed loyalty that bordered on religious devotion. "All clear, Your Grace." Seris nodded. "All clear, Captain, though I suspect we are being watched more carefully than usual." Ryden's expression revealed nothing. "We have been watched since the wedding. The question is who watches and what they intend to do with the information. Keep your men alert. I have a feeling the next 2 weeks will determine whether I remain queen or become a cautionary tale." She entered her chambers and locked the door. The rooms were luxurious in the way imperial accommodations always were. Silk curtains, marble floors, furniture carved from imported wood. Everything expensive and nothing personal. Seris moved to the writing desk and opened a hidden compartment beneath the inkwell. Inside lay 3 letters she had intercepted over the past weeks. Correspondence between Lord Ashmar and someone using no signature. Discussions of troop movements and supply disruptions. References to patience and timing and the inevitable collapse of unstable thrones. Evidence. Not conclusive. Not enough to justify accusations, but enough to confirm her suspicions. She studied the letters by candlelight, memorizing every word, every detail, every small mistake that might eventually become leverage. Outside, Aster Vale slept fitfully beneath stars that cared nothing for empires or the people who built them. Inside, a queen nobody wanted prepared for war that had not yet been declared. The morning Vaelor departed, snow fell across Aster Vale like ash from distant fires. The Imperial army assembled in the Plaza of Triumph, 10,000 soldiers standing in perfect formation beneath banners that snapped in the wind. Cavalry units, infantry divisions, supply wagons loaded with weapons and provisions. An empire preparing to remind its rebellious territories why obedience was not optional. Vaelor sat on a black warhorse that looked like violence barely contained. He wore full battle armor, the black crown replaced by a functional helm of dark steel. Across his back, the sword that had opened throats and broken sieges. Seris stood on the palace steps, watching. They had said goodbye privately an hour earlier. No sentiment, no promises, just practical discussions about contingencies and communication protocols. But when Vaelor looked at her across the plaza, something passed between them that had nothing to do with strategy. Understanding, maybe, or recognition that they had become something more dangerous than king and queen. They had become allies. Vaelor raised his fist, the gesture rippled through the assembled army. Then he turned his horse and rode toward the southern gates. 10,000 soldiers followed. Seris watched until they disappeared beyond the city walls, swallowed by snow and distance, and whatever fate waited in the territories where rebellion burned like wildfire. Captain Ryden moved beside her. "He will win, Your Grace. I have never seen him lose." Seris did not look away from the empty gates. Winning is not the same as surviving. And survival is all that matters when the real enemy is still here. She turned and walked back into the palace. Behind her, Aster Vale continued its performance. Markets opened, Merchants haggled. Children played in streets while their parents worked and worried and wondered if the empire would hold or shatter. Deep within the palace, Mordrin Voss stood in his private chambers reading reports that should not have existed. Detailed analyses of Vaelor's military strategy, predictions about troop movements and engagement timelines, letters written in careful script to someone in the south who signed their correspondence with a single word. Soon. Mordrin smiled like winter learning to speak. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The king was gone, the queen was isolated, and the empire was about to discover what happened when foundations built from fear finally cracked. 3 days after Vaelor's departure, Seris received her first real threat. It arrived disguised as a gift. A wooden box delivered to her chambers by a servant who could not remember who had given it to him. Inside, wrapped in black silk, lay a single dead nightingale with its throat cut. No note, no explanation. Just the bird and the message it carried. You sing too loud. You will be silenced. Captain Ryden wanted to launch an investigation immediately. Question every servant. Search every corner of the palace. Seris stopped him. No, she said quietly. Whoever sent this wants us to panic. Wants us to reveal what we know by how we react. We do nothing. We pretend this never happened. Your Grace, threats like this escalate. If we do nothing, they will assume fear. Good. Let them assume fear. Frightened prey makes mistakes. But so do overconfident predators. She took the dead bird and burned it in the fireplace, watching feathers blacken and curl. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, the game had finally begun. And somewhere in the palace, hidden among servants or nobles or soldiers sworn to protect the crown, an enemy smiled and prepared the next move. Because empires do not fall from outside invasion alone. They fall when the people sworn to protect them decide that protection is less valuable than power. Seris stood in her chambers surrounded by luxury and isolation, watching smoke rise from burning evidence. She thought about Vaelor riding south toward rebellion. She thought about Mordrin moving pieces across a board only he could see. She thought about the dead bird and what it meant. And she realized with absolute clarity that the next 2 weeks would determine everything, whether she lived or died, whether the empire held or shattered, whether a forgotten daughter from a dying house would become a footnote in history, or the woman who saved a kingdom by refusing to be invisible. The snow fell heavier, the palace grew colder, and in the archives deep below, among books documenting the rise and fall of houses that had once seemed eternal, a pattern was emerging. A pattern that connected Lord Ashmar to Lady Thorne to a dozen other nobles whose families had been broken by imperial campaigns. A pattern that led directly to Mordrin Voss and the careful accumulation of power over generations. A pattern that suggested the rebellion in the south was not the real war. It was a distraction. And the real war was about to begin inside the palace walls themselves, where queens died quietly and enemies wore friendly faces and survival demanded sacrifices that no coronation oath had ever prepared anyone to make. Seris touched the queen's circlet on her head. Delicate, beautiful, fragile, like everything in the empire built to break. She whispered to the empty room, "Come back alive, Vaelor, because if you die in the south, Mordrin wins. And I cannot fight an empire alone." Then she walked to her writing desk and began composing letters. Not to allies. She had none. But to people who might become useful if offered the right leverage at the right moment. Because survival was not about strength. It was about knowing exactly when to be visible and when to disappear. When to speak and when to watch. When to trust and when to sharpen knives in the dark. The empire worshipped permanence. But Seris Vale was learning that permanence was just another word for refusing to see the cracks until the entire foundation collapsed. And she had no intention of being buried in the rubble when it finally fell. The palace became a cage dressed in silk. 5 days passed since Vaelor rode south. 5 days of silence, broken only by carefully worded dispatches that revealed nothing useful. The rebellion continues. Engagements ongoing. Casualties acceptable. Military language designed to communicate facts while hiding truth. Seris spent her mornings attending court functions that felt like theatrical performances where everyone knew their lines except her. She smiled at noble wives who despised her. She accepted compliments laced with poison. She pretended not to notice the way conversations died when she entered rooms. But her afternoons belonged to investigation. Captain Ryden became her shadow and her shield. Together they moved through the palace like hunters tracking prey that refused to show itself clearly. The servant who delivered the dead bird had vanished, not fled. Vanished. His quarters were empty. His family claimed they had not seen him in days. No body, no evidence, just absence where a person used to exist. Someone was cleaning up loose ends with surgical precision. Seris stood in the empty servant quarters, while Ryden searched through belongings that revealed nothing except poverty and anonymous existence. "They are professionals," Redan said quietly. "Whoever orchestrated this understands how to make people disappear without creating noise." Seris ran her fingers along the bare wall. "Which means they have done it before. Multiple times. This is not improvisation. This is pattern." She turned to face him. "I need you to find every servant who has disappeared from the palace in the past 3 years. Not transferred, not retired, disappeared. People who stopped existing without explanation." Ryden's scarred face hardened. "That will take time, and it will attract attention. Then be subtle. Use your men. Pay informants if necessary. But I need to know how deep this runs." After Ryden left, Seris remained in the empty room. She thought about power and how it functioned. Not the obvious power of crowns and armies, the invisible power of information and leverage and knowing exactly which threads to pull to unravel entire systems. Mordrin Voss understood that power. He had spent decades building networks through the palace like roots growing through stone. Slow, patient, impossible to remove without destroying the structure they supported. But every network had vulnerabilities. Every system had breaking points. And Seris was beginning to see the architecture beneath the surface. That evening, she hosted a small dinner for influential court ladies. 6 women gathered in the Queen's private dining hall, a space designed for intimate gatherings rather than grand spectacle. The room glowed with candlelight reflecting off polished silver and crystal. Lady Mira Thorne sat directly across from Seris. Up close, the resemblance to her executed father was unmistakable. Same dark eyes, same sharp cheekbones. Same expression that revealed nothing while calculating everything. She wore black silk despite mourning protocols allowing color after 5 years. A deliberate choice. A statement. My father was a traitor who earned his death. But statements always contain subtext. The dinner conversation flowed through safe territory. Fashion, weather, upcoming festivals. The kind of meaningless chatter that filled space without risking substance. Seris played along while watching Mira carefully. The woman ate with precise movements, spoke with calculated brevity, smiled without warmth, everything controlled, everything measured, a performance perfected through years of survival. Near the end of the meal, Seris dismissed the servants. The ladies exchanged glances. Private audiences with the Queen were rare. Private audiences without witnesses were dangerous. Seris poured wine herself, an informality that bordered on insult in a court obsessed with hierarchy. "I want to speak honestly," she said, "without the performance we all maintain for public consumption." Silence settled heavy as snow. Lady Corvin, an older woman who controlled textile trade through her late husband's connections, spoke first. "Honesty is expensive, Your Grace, particularly in palaces." Seris met her gaze without flinching. "So is survival. And I suspect we all understand that survival requires more than pleasant conversation and careful smiles." She looked at each woman in turn. "You tolerate me because protocol demands it, but you do not respect me. I am a queen without power married to a king who chose me for reasons you do not understand. That makes me either pathetic or dangerous. I want you to know which." The women sat frozen. Then Lady Mira Thorne laughed. The sound was sharp as breaking glass. "Dangerous," she said. "Obviously dangerous. Pathetic women do not host dinners where they strip away pretense like skin." Seris turned her attention fully to Mira. "Your father rebelled against the Empire. The king executed him and your brothers. Yet you remain at court, wearing mourning, reminding everyone of what was taken from you. Why?" Mira's smile could have cut stone. "Because leaving would be surrender, and my family does not surrender. We endure, we remember, and we wait for justice that looks different than the Empire's version." The other women shifted uncomfortably. Seris leaned forward. "Justice or revenge?" Mira held her gaze. In my experience, Your Grace, they are often the same thing wearing different masks. The candles flickered. Outside, wind rattled windows while snow continued its endless fall. Seris made a decision that could either save her life or end it. Someone in this palace is orchestrating instability, feeding information to southern rebels, eliminating anyone who notices too much, building towards something larger than simple rebellion. She paused. I need to know who. And I suspect some of you already have suspicions you are too intelligent to voice publicly. The silence stretched until Lady Corvin finally spoke. Why would we help you? You are the king's wife, his ally. Helping you means risking whatever protection our neutrality provides. Seris stood and walked to the window. Below, Astervale glittered with lights that looked beautiful from this distance. Close up, she knew, the city was violent and desperate and constantly negotiating survival. Like everything in the Empire. She turned back to the women. Because if I am right, the instability will not stop with rebellion. It will consume the palace itself. And when that happens, neutrality will not protect you. The only protection will be knowing which side will win and positioning yourself accordingly. Lady Mira stood as well. And you believe your side will win? I believe I am willing to do things other people consider impossible. That makes victory more likely than hoping powerful men will show mercy. Mira studied her for a long moment. Then she smiled, a real smile this time. Recognition between two people who understood the same brutal mathematics. 3 servants have disappeared in the past 18 months, Mira said. All of them worked in administrative wings. All of them had access to documents related to treasury movements and military logistics. She moved closer to Seris. Their families were compensated generously, enough gold to ensure silence. The payments came through intermediaries, but the authorization signatures all traced back to the same office. Seris felt her pulse quicken. Whose office? Mira's expression hardened. The Grand Chancellor's administrative deputy, a man named Corlin Vess, Mordrin's nephew. The other women remained silent, but their faces confirmed what Seris needed to know. They had noticed, they had suspected, they had simply been too afraid to speak. Fear was Control's favorite weapon, but fear could be redirected. Seris returned to the table. If I move against Mordrin, he will destroy me unless I have evidence so overwhelming that even the Imperial Council cannot ignore it. That means I need documentation, witnesses, proof that survives beyond accusation. She looked at each woman. I am not asking for loyalty. I am offering partnership. Help me build that evidence, and when this ends, you will be positioned with the Queen instead of simply tolerated by the Empire. Lady Corvin's eyes narrowed. And if you fail? Then we all fail together. But at least we fail fighting instead of waiting to be eliminated one by one when our usefulness expires. The women exchanged glances, some frightened, some calculating, all recognizing the trap they were already caught inside. Finally, Lady Mira raised her wine glass. To evidence, she said, and to queens who understand that power is not given, it is taken. One by one, the other women raised their glasses. They drank, and the alliance nobody expected began forming in candlelight and desperation. After the dinner ended, Seris walked through empty corridors toward her chambers. Captain Rydan materialized from shadows like a ghost with muscle and scar tissue. You took a risk, Your Grace. Seris did not slow her pace. Survival is risk. The question is whether the risk creates opportunity or simply accelerates death. They reached her chambers. Inside, a fire burned low in the hearth. Her writing desk was covered with correspondence requiring responses. Invitations, requests, the endless administrative weight of appearing relevant. She ignored all of it. Instead, she moved to the hidden compartment beneath the inkwell and withdrew the intercepted letters. 3 pieces of evidence connecting Lord Ashmar to someone using no signature. Not enough to prove conspiracy, but enough to establish pattern. She laid them on the desk beside a blank sheet of parchment. Then she began writing. Not letters this time. A map. A web connecting names and positions and the invisible threads of influence that tied them together. Lord Ashmar controlled grain distribution. His cooperation ensured northern provinces remained fed and loyal. His defection would create famine and chaos. Lady Mira Thorne carried her family's grudge like a blade waiting for the right throat. Her survival at court was not mercy, It was Mordrin keeping a useful tool close. Corlin Vess administered logistics while his uncle provided political cover. Together, they controlled information flow throughout the palace. And at the center of the web, patient as winter and twice as lethal, sat Grand Chancellor Mordrin Voss, a man who had spent decades building power through bureaucracy, a man who understood that emperors died but empires endured, a man who was preparing to prove that crowns were temporary and administrators were eternal. Seris studied her map while firelight cast shadows that looked like blood spreading across parchment. Understanding was not enough. Evidence was not enough. She needed leverage that would force Mordrin into a mistake visible enough that even Vaelor's return could not be dismissed or deflected. She needed to make the invisible enemy show his face. And that meant becoming bait in a trap she would have to spring herself. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like clarity. Because queens who waited for rescue became footnotes. Queens who fought became legends or corpses. And Seris had no intention of being forgotten. The next morning, Seris did something unprecedented. She attended the Imperial Council session. Queens were traditionally excluded from council proceedings. Their role was ceremonial, not administrative. They represented continuity and provided heirs, but they did not participate in governance. Seris walked into the council chamber anyway. The room fell silent. 12 men sat around an obsidian table carved with the Empire's crest. Administrators and generals and advisors who had served under 3 different kings. Men who measured power in decades rather than years. Mordrin Voss sat at the head in Vaelor's absence, silver robes catching light from high windows. His expression revealed nothing. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, "the council is honored by your presence, though protocol typically restricts attendance to appointed members." Seris moved to the empty chair reserved for the king. Protocol also restricts Grand Chancellors from occupying the throne's seat. Yet here we are, adapting to necessity. She sat. The gesture was deliberate provocation. Several council members exchanged glances. Others stared at the table. None spoke. Mordrin's smile tightened microscopically. Of course. In the king's absence, flexibility serves the Empire's interests. How may we assist you, Your Grace? Seris placed a single document on the table. I have concerns about supply chain disruptions in the northern provinces. Grain shipments have decreased by 30% over the past 6 months. Famine creates instability. Instability creates rebellion. I want to understand why this is happening and what measures are being implemented to resolve it. Lord Ashmar shifted in his seat. Supply fluctuations are normal, Your Grace. Weather. Transportation challenges. Nothing that requires council intervention. Seris turned her attention to him like a blade finding flesh. Nothing except starving populations and increasing resentment toward imperial governance. Unless you believe hungry people make loyal subjects. Ashmar's face darkened. The Queen misunderstands agricultural complexity. Seris leaned forward. Then educate me. Explain why shipments decreased precisely when Southern rebellion required Northern stability. Explain why the disruptions align with territories that border rebel-controlled regions. Explain coincidence that looks suspiciously like strategy. The room went very still. Mordrin intervened with practiced calm. Your Grace raises valid concerns. Lord Ashmar, perhaps a detailed report outlining supply chain challenges would provide clarity. We can review together and implement corrective measures. Seris did not look away from Ashmar. I want the report by tomorrow. Complete documentation, transportation manifests, distribution records, everything. Ashmar's jaw clenched. Such comprehensive documentation requires time to compile. Then you should start immediately. The silence that followed carried weight like stone settling into water. Finally, Mordrin spoke. Is there anything else the council can address, Your Grace? Seris stood. Just one thing. The king entrusted this empire to your collective stewardship during his absence. I intend to ensure that trust is honored, which means I will be attending future council sessions to observe how the empire is maintained. She moved toward the door, then paused. Transparency serves everyone's interests, unless someone has reason to prefer shadows. She left without waiting for response. Behind her, the council erupted into muted chaos. Captain Ryden waited in the corridor. That was bold, Your Grace. Seris kept walking. Bold is just another word for necessary when subtle has stopped working. You have made enemies. I already had enemies. Now they know I see them. They reached a branching corridor. Raiden stepped closer, voice dropping. Lady Mira sent word. She has located documents that might prove useful, but retrieving them requires accessing the administrative archives after hours. When? Tonight. Third bell after midnight. She will create a distraction. You will have approximately 10 minutes. Seris felt ice and fire move through her veins simultaneously. 10 minutes to find evidence in archives that contain decades of Imperial records. 10 minutes to either secure leverage or spring a trap. Tell her I will be there. That night, Seris lay in bed pretending to sleep while listening to the palace breathe around her. Servants moved through corridors on final rounds. Guards changed shifts with military precision. Somewhere in the distance, music played from noble quarters where people who did not fear assassination drank and celebrated their own importance. The palace was a living thing built from stone and ambition, and Seris was about to cut into its heart. The third bell chimed like iron striking bone. She rose and dressed in dark clothing. No jewelry, no circlet, nothing that identified her as queen. Captain Raiden waited outside with two of his men. They moved through shadowed corridors using servant passages that bypassed main halls. The palace had been built over centuries, each expansion adding complexity. Seris had spent weeks memorizing the layout, understanding that knowledge of terrain was its own kind of weapon. They reached the administrative archives without incident. The door was locked, but Raiden produced keys that should not have existed. Former soldiers learned skills that protocol preferred to ignore. Inside, the archives stretched into darkness broken only by moonlight through high windows. Rows of shelves held documents organized by year and category. Ledgers, correspondence, reports. The accumulated bureaucracy of empire reduced to paper and ink. Seris lit a shielded lantern. Somewhere in this ocean of records existed proof of Mordrin's conspiracy. Documents showing payments to disappeared servants, correspondence with southern rebels, evidence of the patient construction of treason. She moved quickly through labeled sections: treasury disbursements, military logistics, administrative appointments. Her hand shook slightly as she pulled ledgers and scanned entries. Minutes evaporated like water on hot stone. Then she found it. A ledger from 18 months ago showing payments authorized by Corlin Vess. Large amounts. No explanation beyond administrative costs. She cross-referenced dates with the list of disappeared servants Raiden had compiled. Perfect alignment. Every disappearance matched a payment. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She kept searching. Found correspondence between Mordrin and Lord Ashmar discussing strategic grain reductions to create pressure on northern territories. Found documents outlining plans to weaken Vaelor through prolonged military engagement that would drain resources and create council justification for limiting royal authority. Found everything except direct proof of contact with Caedron's soul. That was hidden too well. But what she had was enough. Enough to establish pattern. Enough to prove conspiracy. Enough to force Mordrin into a position where denial became impossible. She began collecting documents when the distraction ended. Bells erupted throughout the palace. Fire. Someone was screaming about fire. Redan appeared in the doorway. We need to leave. Now. Seris gathered the documents and moved toward the exit. They navigated back through servant passages while the palace exploded into chaos. Guards running, servants scrambling, nobles emerging from quarters demanding explanation. The fire was small, contained to a storage room far from anything important, a distraction exactly as planned. But as Seris neared her chambers, she realized something was wrong. The corridor was too quiet, too empty. Redan sensed it too. His hand moved to his sword. Then they emerged from shadows. 6 men in palace guard uniforms. But Seris recognized the way they moved. Not guards. Assassins wearing stolen clothing. Raiden and his 2 soldiers formed a barrier. Get the queen to safety, Raiden ordered. The assassins attacked. Steel rang against steel in the confined corridor. Blood sprayed across marble walls. Men screamed and died while Seris ran. One of Raiden's soldiers fell with a blade through his throat. The second bought her 10 seconds before he collapsed. Raiden fought like a demon carved from scar tissue and violence, but he was outnumbered. Seris reached her chamber doors. Locked. From the inside. Impossible. She turned as the remaining assassins approached. 3 of them. moving with professional efficiency. No hurry, no anger, just men performing a job they had been paid to complete. Behind them, Raiden lay bleeding on marble, not dead yet, but dying. The lead assassin drew a knife designed for throats. Nothing personal, Your Grace. Just business. Seris backed against her locked door. Her mind raced through options that did not exist. No weapon, no escape, no time. Just 3 professional killers, and the certain knowledge that she was about to die in a palace corridor while the Empire pretended not to notice. Then the door behind her opened. She fell backward into her chambers. Stood there, blade ready, was Lady Mira Thorne. Behind her, 4 more women. The ladies from the dinner. Armed with daggers and expressions carved from survival instinct. The assassins paused. This was not part of their plan. Mira smiled like winter learning to cut. You gentlemen seem lost. These are the Queen's private chambers. Visiting hours have ended. The lead assassin's expression hardened. Move aside. This does not concern you. Mira stepped forward. Everything in this palace concerns me, particularly when hired killers mistake their odds. She gestured. The women spread into formation. 4 women armed with daggers against 3 professional assassins should have been slaughter. But these women had survived court politics for decades. They understood violence that wore expensive dresses. The fight was brutal and brief. 2 assassins died quickly, surprised by competence they had not anticipated. The third managed to wound Lady Corvin before Mira's blade found his kidney. He collapsed, gasping. Mira knelt beside him. Who hired you? The man coughed blood, smiled, and died without answering. Seris stood frozen, document still clutched against her chest, watching noble ladies wipe blood from daggers with the calm efficiency of women who had always known violence was inevitable. Mira stood and faced her. You were right, she said quietly. Neutrality is death. Better to choose a side and fight. Seris found her voice. Raiden. He's wounded in the corridor. 2 women moved immediately to help the fallen captain. Seris looked at the dead assassins, then at the women who had saved her life, then at the documents she had risked everything to obtain, evidence of conspiracy, proof of treason, and the absolute certainty that Mordrin Voss now knew she was no longer bait. She was a threat. The palace bells continued ringing, fire contained, assassins dead, the queen alive against all expectation. And somewhere in the administrative wings, a grand chancellor was recalculating strategy with the cold precision of a man who had spent decades planning for every contingency except this one. A queen who refused to die quietly. Seris moved to her writing desk and added the new documents to her growing collection. The web of evidence was nearly complete, but evidence alone would not be enough. Mordrin controlled the council, controlled the bureaucracy, controlled enough of the palace infrastructure that direct accusation would be deflected or buried. She needed more than proof. She needed leverage that would force him into the open. She needed Vaelor to return before Mordrin could eliminate her permanently. And she needed to survive long enough for either to matter. Lady Mira stood beside her. What now? Seris looked at the evidence spread across her desk, looked at the women who had chosen alliance over neutrality, looked at Captain Raiden being bandaged by servants while bleeding from wounds that should have killed him. Now we stop hiding, she said. Now we make Mordrin understand that killing me will cost more than letting me live. How? Seris smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. We do what desperate people have always done when cornered by superior force. We change the terrain. We make the fight public. We ensure that if I die, everyone knows exactly who ordered it. The women waited. Seris continued. Tomorrow, I am hosting a public assembly in the Grand Hall. Every noble house, every administrator, every person with influence or curiosity. And I am going to present evidence of conspiracy against the throne. Mira's eyes widened. Mordrin will have you arrested before you finish speaking. Then he reveals himself as traitor in front of witnesses. Either way, the shadows stopped protecting him. It was suicide dressed as strategy. But it was also the only move left on a board where every other option led to quiet death. The women looked at each other. Then, one by one, they nodded. Because they understood what Seris had learned. Power was not about strength. It was about being willing to risk everything when survival demanded it. And survival demanded everything now. The night stretched toward dawn. In the corridors, servants cleaned blood from marble. In the administrative wings, Mordrin Voss read reports about failed assassination and recalculated timelines. In the military camps far to the south, Vaelor Draven crushed the last of Kydron Sol's forces and began the journey home to a capital that was collapsing from within. And in the Queen's chambers, Seris Vale prepared for war. Not the kind fought with armies. The kind fought with words and evidence, and the desperate gamble that truth could survive long enough to matter. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she wrote. A speech that would either save the Empire or destroy her. Words that named traitors and detailed conspiracy, and demanded justice from a system built to protect power rather than truth. As dawn broke across Aster Vale, painting the city in shades of blood and gold, Seris stood at her window, watching the Empire wake. Somewhere out there, Vaelor was riding home. Somewhere in the palace, Mordrin was planning her death. Somewhere between survival and destruction, the future of the Empire balanced on decisions made by people who had never expected to matter. She touched the documents one final time. Then she locked them in a case designed to survive fire. Because if she died today, the evidence would remain. And someone would find it. Someone would know the truth. And truth, however delayed, was its own kind of justice. The Grand Hall filled slowly as morning stretched toward noon. Nobles arrived curious and cautious. Administrators came because protocol demanded attendance. Soldiers stood along the walls, uncertain whether they were witnesses or participants in whatever was about to unfold. Seris stood backstage, heart hammering, hands steady through sheer force of will. Lady Mira appeared beside her. Ready? Seris looked at the women who had become allies through desperation and mutual survival. No, she said honestly. But ready was never the point. Necessary is the point. And this is necessary. She walked onto the platform. The hall fell silent. Hundreds of faces turned toward her, some sympathetic, some hostile. Most simply waiting to see whether she would provide entertainment or tragedy. Seris wore the Queen's circlet and royal silk, not armor, a costume designed to remind everyone exactly what was at stake. She looked across the assembled crowd until she found Mordrin Voss. The Grand Chancellor sat among council members, expression carved from patient stone. Their eyes met, and in that moment, both understood. This was the point of no return. Whatever happened next would determine everything. Empire or ashes, truth or comfortable lies, survival or the kind of death that echoed through history. Seris took a breath, opened her mouth to speak. And in the southern territories, Vaelor Draven discovered documents in Kydron Sol's command tent. Letters, correspondence, years of communication with someone in Aster Vale, someone who had arranged everything, the rebellion, the instability, the death of his first wife, all orchestrated by the same patient hand. He read the signature at the bottom of the final letter, and the world stopped, because the enemy was not who he expected. The enemy was not just Mordrin. The conspiracy reached deeper, involved people he had trusted implicitly, extended into foundations he had believed unshakable. Vaelor stood in the captured tent surrounded by smoke and blood and the ruins of rebellion, and realized he was riding home to a palace that was already lost. Unless Seris had survived, unless she had discovered what he now knew, unless she was strong enough to do what he should have done years ago. Burn everything and start again. He mounted his horse, gave orders to his generals, and began riding north with an urgency that bordered on panic, because queens who fought empires alone rarely survived, and he had left her alone too long. Back in Aster Vale, Seris began speaking, and the Empire held its breath. Seris's voice cut through the grand hall like steel drawn from a scabbard. I stand before you not as decoration, but as witness to treason that has poisoned this empire from within. The assembled nobles shifted. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through dry grass before fire. Mordrin Voss remained motionless, but Seris caught the microscopic tightening around his eyes, the only crack in his performance. She continued, each word measured and deliberate. For months, someone has fed intelligence to southern rebels. Military routes, treasury movements, information that should have been impossible to access. Servants have disappeared. Evidence has been buried. And all of it traces back to offices within this very palace. The whispers grew louder. Seris gestured, and Lady Mira stepped forward carrying the locked case. The evidence laid out before them was methodical. ledgers showing payments to disappeared servants, correspondence between Lord Ashmar and unsigned contacts discussing strategic starvation, documents outlining plans to weaken the king through prolonged conflict, everything except direct proof connecting Mordrin. But the web was clear enough. Lord Ashmar stood abruptly, face darkening to the color of old blood. This is absurd. The Queen manufactures conspiracy from administrative routine. She understands nothing of governance and seeks to create chaos through ignorance. Seris turned toward him with the calm of someone who had already accepted death. Then explain why grain shipments to northern provinces decreased by 30%, precisely when southern rebellion required northern stability. Explain the payments. Explain the disappeared servants whose families received gold sufficient to ensure silence. Ashmar's mouth opened, closed. No words emerged that would not damn him further. Mordrin finally stood. His movement was unhurried, elegant, a man accustomed to controlling rooms through presence rather than volume. Your Grace has presented concerning allegations. The Council takes such matters seriously and will conduct thorough investigation. However, public accusation without conclusive proof damages the very stability you claim to protect. His voice carried the weight of decades administering imperial authority. I suggest we adjourn this assembly and review the evidence privately. Justice requires precision, not spectacle. The crowd murmured agreement. Mordrin's reasonableness was disarming. His calm suggested control. Seris felt the room slipping away from her. Then the bronze doors at the far end of the hall crashed open. Guards poured through, weapons drawn, but not palace guards. These men wore armor marked with the king's personal crest. Vaelor's elite unit. The soldiers who answered to no one except the throne itself. And leading them was Captain Ryden Kor, wounded, bandaged, moving like a man held together by fury and loyalty. He walked straight to the platform and handed Seris a sealed dispatch. From the king, your grace, urgent, delivered by fast riders who killed their horses getting here. Seris broke the seal with hands that barely trembled, read the letter, and felt the world tilt. The handwriting was Vaelor's, unmistakable. She had studied enough of his correspondence to recognize the sharp angles and brutal efficiency. But the content was impossible. Seris. Documents recovered from Kadrin's command tent reveal conspiracy deeper than anticipated. Mordrin involved, but not alone. The rebellion was coordinated by someone with access to my private counsels, someone I trusted completely. General Cade Theron has been feeding intelligence to enemies for 3 years. Arrested him myself. He confessed before execution. Others implicated. Return imminent. Trust no one. Vaelor. Her vision blurred at the edges. General Theron. The man who had argued most passionately for immediate military response. The warrior Vaelor had known for 15 years. A traitor wearing loyalty like costume. But the letter continued, and the next line stopped her heart. Additional documents suggest my first wife Elira's death was not accident, arranged by someone inside the palace. Mordrin suspected, but evidence points to coordination with another. A woman. Description matches someone currently at court. Investigate Lady Mira Thorne. Do not trust her. She is not what she appears. Seris looked up slowly. Lady Mira stood 3 feet away, expression unreadable. Their eyes met, and Seris saw it. The microscopic tension in Mira's jaw, the slight shift in posture, the way her hand had moved imperceptibly closer to the dagger hidden beneath her sleeve. Recognition between hunter and prey. Except Seris could not tell which role belonged to whom. The hall exploded into chaos. Mordrin's voice cut through the noise with surgical precision. It appears the Queen's investigation has uncovered truths even she did not anticipate. Captain Kor, place Lady Thorne under arrest immediately. Ryden moved. Mira was faster. She drew her blade and lunged not at Ryden, but at Seris. The attack came with professional speed. No hesitation. No warning. Just motion translated into lethal intent. Seris threw herself backward. The blade missed her throat by inches. Guards converged from all directions. Mira fought like a woman who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. She killed 2 guards before Ryden's sword found her shoulder, spinning her around. Blood sprayed across marble. She collapsed but kept hold of her weapon, eyes locked on Seris with hatred so pure it felt like physical force. You stupid bitch, Mira hissed through gritted teeth. "You were supposed to die quietly. You were supposed to be nothing." Seris stood frozen, mind racing through implications that rewrote everything she thought she understood. Mira had saved her life during the assassination attempt. Or had she? The assassins had been real. The fight had been real. But what if Mira had orchestrated both the attack and the rescue to gain Seris's trust? What if the alliance had been manipulation from the beginning? Guards dragged Mira away while she laughed. The sound was broken glass mixed with madness. "You think you won? You think any of this matters? The Empire is already dead. Vaelor just does not know it yet." Her voice faded as guards hauled her through the bronze doors. The grand hall sat in shocked silence. Nobles stared at the blood on marble, at the queen standing pale and shaking on the platform, at Mordrin Voss, who had somehow emerged from chaos looking more in control than ever. The Grand Chancellor's voice was gentle, almost sympathetic. "Your Grace has endured a terrible ordeal. Clearly, Lady Thorn manipulated your trust to position herself close to the throne. Her family's grudge ran deeper than anyone suspected." He moved toward the platform with measured steps. "The evidence you presented regarding Lord Ashmar and administrative corruption will be investigated thoroughly. But perhaps it would be wise to retire to your chambers while the Council addresses these matters with appropriate discretion." It was dismissal dressed as concern. Seris looked at him. Really looked. And saw the truth she had been too focused on details to recognize. Mordrin was not trying to kill her. He was trying to control her. Every move, every threat, every manipulation had been designed not to eliminate the queen, but to make her dependent on the very system he controlled. The assassins had been real but poorly coordinated. Easy for Mira to defeat. Easy for Seris to survive if she had the right help. The evidence she had gathered pointed to conspiracy but never quite reached Mordrin himself, always stopping one layer away. Even now, he was positioning himself as the reasonable authority, protecting her from threats she could not navigate alone. Because a dead queen created martyrdom and instability. But a frightened queen who depended on the Grand Chancellor's protection? That was control disguised as salvation. Seris felt something cold and terrible settle in her chest. She had been playing checkers while Mordrin orchestrated chess. But she had one advantage he could not anticipate. She had stopped caring whether she survived. Her voice emerged steady, despite the fear trying to strangle it. "No." Mordrin paused. "Your Grace?" Seris straightened, ignoring the blood on her dress and the trembling in her legs. "I will not retire. I will not defer to private investigation. The Empire deserves transparency, not convenient discretion." She turned to address the assembled nobles. "Lady Thorn attempted assassination in front of hundreds of witnesses. Her guilt is established. But her confession suggests conspiracy extends beyond one woman's vendetta. General Theron's treason proves the rot reaches into military command. How deep does it go? Who else wears loyalty while serving betrayal?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Mordrin's expression finally showed strain. "Your Grace, emotional reaction is understandable, but governance requires rational process. Public accusations without proper investigation creates panic rather than justice." Seris smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "You are absolutely right, Chancellor, which is why I am ordering full investigation into every office, every administrator, every person with access to sensitive information, starting with the Grand Chancellor's administrative staff." The hall went silent. Mordrin's mask cracked further. That would be unprecedented. The Grand Chancellor's office has maintained independence since the Empire's founding. Royal authority does not extend to administrative oversight without council approval. Seris descended from the platform, moving through the crowd toward Mordrin. "Then call a council vote. Right now. In front of everyone. Let us see who supports transparency and who prefers shadows." She stopped directly in front of him. Up close, she could see the calculations running behind his colorless eyes, the rapid assessment of options and consequences. He was trapped. Voting against investigation suggested guilt. Voting for it meant exposing networks built over decades. Either way, he lost the invisibility that made him untouchable. Mordrin's smile was a wound learning to speak. "Very well, Your Grace. Though I suspect you will find nothing except administrative routine. Competence often appears suspicious to those unfamiliar with governance complexity." He turned to the assembled council members. all in favor of comprehensive investigation into administrative offices, including the Grand Chancellor's staff. Signal assent. Hands rose slowly, one by one. Council members recognizing that refusal would mark them as complicit. The vote passed unanimously. Mordrin's expression revealed nothing, but Seris saw the fury in the rigid set of his shoulders. She had forced him into the open, not completely, but enough that shadows no longer protected him absolutely. The assembly dissolved into chaotic discussion. Nobles clustered in groups, processing revelations that had upended their understanding of palace politics. Guards escorted council members to administrative wings where investigation would begin immediately. Captain Raiden moved beside Seris. "That was dangerous, Your Grace. Everything is dangerous now." She looked at the bronze doors where Mira had been dragged away. "I need to speak with her, privately." Raiden's scarred face hardened. "She tried to kill you, which means she knows something worth dying for. People do not commit suicide by assassination unless the alternative is worse." The interrogation chamber sat deep beneath the palace in sections built when the Empire was young and torture was considered administrative necessity rather than moral failing. Stone walls, iron rings, drainage channels carved into floors designed for blood. Mira Thorne sat chained to a chair in the center, shoulder bandaged roughly, face pale from blood loss. But her eyes remained sharp. Seris entered alone despite Raiden's protests. The door closed with finality that echoed in the confined space. For a long moment, the two women studied each other. Finally, Mira laughed. The sound was raw and broken. "You actually came. I thought you would send interrogators." Seris pulled a chair close and sat. "I need to understand. You saved my life. Then you tried to kill me. Which was real?" Mira's smile was terrible. "Both." "Neither." "Does it matter?" "Yes." Mira leaned back as much as chains allowed. "My father was executed for rebellion. He did not start. My brothers died for crimes they did not commit. Your husband destroyed my family because someone convinced him we were threats. That someone was Mordrin Voss, who needed to eliminate a house that was beginning to question his accumulation of power." Her voice carried decades of compressed rage. "I spent 5 years at court being tolerated, being pitied, being ignored, and I used every second to learn, to watch, to understand how power really moved through this empire." She met Seris's gaze. "Mordrin offered me revenge, not against Vaelor directly. Too obvious, but against the empire itself. Tear it down slowly. Make it eat itself. Prove that the entire system was rotten and my father's death was just one symptom of deeper disease. So you helped orchestrate rebellion. I helped orchestrate chaos. The rebellion was convenient. General Theron's bitterness was useful. Your marriage was unexpected but adaptable. What was the plan?" Mira's eyes glittered. "Use you as catalyst. Make you visible enough that Mordrin would have to eliminate you publicly. When you died, Vaelor would discover evidence pointing to Mordrin. The king would destroy the Grand Chancellor. Civil war would fracture the empire. And in the chaos, everything my father built his life serving would collapse into ash. And saving me from assassins? Real assassins working for Mordrin without his nephew Corlan's knowledge. Internal conflict within the conspiracy itself. I killed them to gain your trust and to prove to Mordrin that I was more valuable alive than his clumsy tools." Seris felt sick. The alliance was manipulation. From the beginning. You were useful, intelligent, desperate. Everything I needed to accelerate the timeline. Why try to kill me today? Mira's smile vanished. Because you stopped being useful and became dangerous. You were supposed to present evidence and die for it. Martyrdom that would ignite the empire. Instead, you survived. Vaelor's letter exposed me before I could position myself as your grieving ally. The plan collapsed. Her voice dropped to a whisper. So I tried to salvage something. If I killed you in front of everyone, Vaelor would return to a dead wife and a shattered court. Grief makes men stupid. He would have torn the empire apart looking for everyone responsible. Seris sat in silence while torchlight cast shadows that looked like blood spreading across stone. Finally, she spoke. Do you regret it? Mira's laugh was broken glass. Every day. But regret changes nothing. My family is still dead. The empire is still rotten. and I am still exactly what the Empire made me. She leaned forward as much as chains allowed. You want to know the worst part? I liked you. Genuinely. You were everything I could have been if my father had not been murdered for political convenience. Smart, adaptable, willing to fight when fighting was the only option. Her eyes glistened. But liking you was not enough to stop hating what you represented. What did I represent? Hope that the Empire could be saved. And I could not allow that hope to survive. Seris stood, walked to the door, paused with her hand on cold iron. My father told me once that revenge is just grief wearing armor. I did not understand until now. She looked back at Mira. I am sorry for what the Empire took from you, but I cannot let that justify what you tried to take from everyone else. Mira's smile was sad and terrible. I know. That is why you will make a better queen than I ever could have been. Seris left. The door closed. Behind it, Mira Thorne sat alone in darkness, waiting for whatever justice the Empire would decide she deserved. The investigation moved with brutal efficiency. Raidan's men tore through administrative offices like wolves through sheep. Documents were seized. Staff were questioned. The careful architecture of bureaucracy was dismantled piece by piece. What they found exceeded even Seris's expectations. Mordrin had not just built networks of influence. He had constructed an entire shadow government operating parallel to legitimate authority, payments to nobles in exchange for votes, blackmail files on council members, secret agreements with merchant guilds that gave him control over trade routes, military promotions orchestrated to place loyal officers in strategic positions, 3 decades of patient construction, an empire within the empire, and all of it legal enough that prosecution would be nearly impossible because Mordrin had never broken laws. He had simply mastered them so completely that he could achieve through regulation what others required force to accomplish. Seris stood in the Grand Chancellor's office, surrounded by evidence of systemic corruption that was somehow not quite criminal. Captain Raiden shook his head. We have enough to prove he is a manipulative bastard. Not enough to prove treason, because treason requires proof of active harm to the throne. Everything here shows influence and control, but stops short of direct conspiracy against the king. Seris studied the document spread across Mordrin's desk. Then we are back where we started, knowing the truth but unable to prove it in ways that matter. The sound of boots on marble interrupted them. A messenger burst through the door, breathing hard. Your Grace, the king has returned. Vaelor entered Aster Vale like a storm given human form. His army spread through the city in disciplined formation while citizens watched from windows and doorways. The Southern Rebellion was crushed, enemy banners burned. Lord Kadrin Sol's head rode on a pike at the front of the column. Victory, complete and absolute. But Vaelor's face showed no triumph, only exhaustion and something darker. He rode directly to the palace without ceremony or celebration, dismounted in the courtyard while servants scrambled to attend him, pushed past protocol and guards and administrators, all trying to brief him on events he already knew from dispatches. He found Seris in the throne room. She stood before the black crown, which sat on its pedestal like a captured piece of night sky. When she heard his boots on marble, she turned. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Two people who had entered a marriage as political necessity and somehow become something neither had planned. Allies. Maybe more. Vaelor's voice was rough from days of shouting orders across battlefields. You are alive. Barely. He moved closer, armor still spattered with dried blood and mud from hard riding. I received reports. Assassination attempt. Lady Thorne's betrayal. Mordrin's corruption exposed but unprovable. His eyes searched her face. You did what I should have done years ago. You refused to accept that power makes people untouchable. Seris felt tears threatening but forced them back. I did what was necessary, same as you. Vaelor reached out and touched her face with hands that had killed men hours earlier but were surprisingly gentle. I chose you as bait. I told myself it was strategy, that sacrificing one person to expose conspiracy was justified. He paused. I was wrong. You are not bait. You are not sacrifice. You are the only person in this empire who has told me truth without calculating advantage. Seris leaned into his touch despite herself. Truth is expensive. So is trust. but I'm learning that some costs are worth paying. The moment stretched between them. Then Vaelor withdrew his hand and turned toward the throne. Mordrin needs to be dealt with. But you are right that evidence is insufficient for execution. Council would fracture if I moved against him without ironclad proof. So what do we do? Vaelor's expression hardened into something ancient and terrible. We give him a choice. Retire gracefully and live in exile with his accumulated wealth intact. Or fight this publicly and watch me dismantle every network he built, even if it means burning down half the Empire's bureaucracy. That is not justice. No. But it is survival. And right now, survival matters more than satisfaction. Seris wanted to argue. Wanted to demand that Mordrin face consequences that matched his crimes. But she had learned enough about power to recognize when compromise was the only path forward. The confrontation happened privately in Vaelor's war room. Just 3 people. The king, the queen, the grand chancellor. Mordrin entered with the same elegant calm he had maintained for decades. Nothing in his posture suggested a man facing exile or execution. Your Majesty. Your Grace. I assume this is not a social visit. Vaelor sat behind the table where he had planned campaigns that conquered territories and crushed rebellions. You have a choice, Chancellor. Retire immediately. Accept exile to the eastern reaches with sufficient funds to live comfortably. Never return to Aster Vale or involve yourself in imperial politics. Or I spend the next year systematically destroying every network you built. I promote new administrators. I restructure the council. I investigate every noble you have leverage over and offer them immunity in exchange for testimony. And when I am finished, you will have nothing except a cell and the knowledge that your life's work died with you. Mordrin's expression did not change. That would destabilize the Empire. Administrative chaos during Reconstruction would create vulnerabilities our enemies would exploit. Vaelor leaned forward. Then I will deal with those vulnerabilities the way I deal with everything. Through force. It will be messy and expensive and people will die. But the Empire will survive because empires always survive. The question is whether you survive with it. Silence filled the room like water rising. Finally, Mordrin spoke. And if I choose exile? What guarantee do I have that you will not simply have me killed once I am beyond the palace walls? My word as king, which is worth more than any contract because breaking it would damage my authority. You live, comfortably, anonymously, as long as you never attempt to return or influence imperial affairs. Mordrin studied Vaelor's face for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was the first genuine expression Seris had ever seen from him. You have grown, Your Majesty. When you took the throne, you thought power was about domination. Now you understand it is about calculation. He stood. I accept exile, not because I fear death, but because I spent 3 decades building systems that will outlast both of us. You can replace administrators and restructure councils, but the Empire has learned to function through bureaucracy rather than personality. That was always my real achievement. He looked at Seris. And you, Your Grace. You were the variable I did not anticipate. I expected fragility. Found steel instead. Seris met his gaze without flinching. I expected a villain. Found a man who loved the Empire enough to control it rather than serve it. I'm not sure which is worse. Mordrin's smile widened. Neither am I. He walked to the door, paused. One final observation, Your Majesty. The Empire survives not because of kings, but despite them. You may wear the crown, but the real power will always belong to those patient enough to outlast individual reigns. Then he left. Guards escorted him to prepare for exile. Vaelor and Seris sat in silence. Finally, she spoke. He is right, you know. We did not win. We just delayed the inevitable. Vaelor stood and moved to the window overlooking Aster Vale. Maybe. But delay is its own kind of victory when the alternative is immediate collapse. He turned to face her. The Empire is broken. Not just corruption, the entire foundation. We built permanence on fear and wondered why everything felt fragile. What are you saying? I am saying we need to change the Empire itself, not just replace administrators. Restructure authority. Distribute power so no single person can accumulate what Mordrin did. Make the system resilient rather than rigid. Seris moved beside him. That will take years, maybe decades, and it will face resistance from every noble house that benefits from current structure. Vaelor's smile was grim. Then we fight those battles the same way we fought this one, together. With allies we build rather than enemies we inherit. He looked at her. I chose you as bait. You became a queen. Now I am asking you to become something more dangerous. What? A partner in rebuilding an empire that does not worship permanence but understands adaptation. Seris felt the weight of what he was offering. Not just marriage, not just queenship, real partnership in reshaping the structure of authority itself. It was terrifying. It was impossible. It was everything she had never imagined wanting. She took his hand. Then we better start by addressing the immediate problem. What problem? The fact that half the council still thinks I am decoration, and the other half thinks I am dangerous. Neither respects me enough to accept real authority. Vaelor's laugh was rough but genuine. Then we make them afraid to dismiss you. Fear is the only currency this empire truly values. How? By making you visible in ways they cannot ignore. Joint rule. Shared authority. Queen Regent in my absence with full council access. That is unprecedented. So was choosing you in the first place. Apparently I specialize in precedent destruction. They stood together watching the city below. Aster Vale glittered in late afternoon light, beautiful and brutal and endlessly negotiating survival, like the people who inhabited it, like the empire itself. Seris thought about everything that had led to this moment. The assassination attempts, the betrayals, the alliances built from desperation, the evidence gathered in darkness, the confrontation that could have ended with her blood on marble, all of it necessary, all of it brutal, all of it teaching her that survival was not about avoiding danger but learning to navigate it without losing yourself completely. She looked at Vaelor, really looked, saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he carried, the way violence and authority had carved his face into something harder than it should have been, but also saw something she had not expected. Respect. Not for her title, for her. It was strange and unfamiliar and terrifying, because respect meant expectations, and expectations meant the possibility of failure, but it also meant she mattered in ways that transcended political necessity. I will do it, she said quietly. But on one condition, name it. You teach me everything, strategy, military command, administrative complexity, all of it. I will not be a partner who contributes only ideas while you handle execution. Vaelor's expression softened slightly. That will take years, and it will be harder than anything you have faced so far. I have survived assassination, betrayal, and Mordrin Voss. I think I can handle education. His smile was brief but real. Then we start tomorrow. Tonight, we address the council and make the announcement. Seris felt her pulse quicken. They will resist. Let them. Resistance reveals who needs to be replaced. He moved toward the door, paused, looked back. Thank you. For what? For refusing to die quietly. For doing what I was too afraid to do. For proving that strength is not always about domination. Seris did not know how to respond to that. So she simply nodded and followed him out of the war room toward whatever battles waited in the council chambers ahead. The announcement happened that evening in the Hall of Governance. The entire council assembled along with administrative heads and military commanders recently returned from the south. Vaelor stood before them in full ceremonial armor, with the black crown catching torchlight. Seris stood beside him wearing the queen's circlet and royal silk, equal in presentation if not yet in authority. Vaelor's voice filled the hall. The Southern Rebellion is crushed. Lord Cadrin Saul is dead. General Theron executed for treason. Lady Mira Thorne imprisoned awaiting trial. Grand Chancellor Mordrin Voss retired to exile. Pause. The Empire has survived external threat and internal conspiracy, but survival is not victory. It is merely delayed death unless we address the foundational weaknesses that made conspiracy possible. The assembled officials shifted uncomfortably. Vaelor continued. Effective immediately, Queen Seris will assume joint authority over council proceedings. She will have full access to all administrative records. She will participate in military strategy sessions. And in my absence, she will serve as Queen Regent with authority to make binding decisions. The hall erupted. Voices overlapped. Protests and questions and outrage barely contained by protocol. Lord Ashmar, still present despite investigation pending, stood. Your Majesty, this is unprecedented. The Queen's role is ceremonial. Joint rule has no foundation in imperial law or tradition. Vaelor's expression was carved from winter. Neither did conquering 3 provinces in 2 years. Neither did restructuring military command. Neither did most of what built this empire. Precedent is just history written by people too afraid to change. Another voice. General Corvin, a veteran commander. With respect, Your Majesty, the Queen lacks military experience. How can she participate in strategic planning without understanding warfare? Seris spoke before Vaelor could respond. Her voice was steady despite the hammering of her heart. General Corvin is correct. I lack military experience. I also lacked political training, lacked administrative knowledge, lacked everything except the intelligence to learn and the willingness to fight when cornered. She moved forward. I have survived more assassination attempts in 3 months than most of you face in lifetimes. I have uncovered conspiracy while you administered routine. I have made alliances and built networks while you followed established procedure. Her gaze swept the assembly. I do not need your respect yet, but I will earn it, and those who cannot accept that will be replaced by people willing to adapt. The hall went silent. Lord Ashmar's face darkened. And if we refuse? If the council votes against this unprecedented power grab? Vaelor's smile was a weapon. Then I disband the council and rebuild administrative structure from foundations up. You are welcome to test whether I am bluffing. No one moved, because everyone in that hall understood Vaelor Draven was not a man who bluffed. He conquered. He crushed. He rebuilt empires according to his vision, regardless of tradition or resistance. Slowly, one by one, the officials bowed their heads in acceptance. Not agreement, acceptance. Because in empires built on fear and power, survival required recognizing when resistance became suicide. The session ended. Nobles filed out in stunned silence. Administrators moved toward their offices to process implications that would reshape their entire understanding of imperial authority. Seris and Vaelor remained in the empty hall. That could have gone worse, Vaelor said. Seris laughed despite herself. They hate me. They fear you. Fear is more useful than affection. She looked at the empty seats, at the throne waiting like a monument to permanence, at the black crown that had seen kings rise and fall while the empire endured. I do not want to become what Mordrin was, she said quietly. I do not want to spend decades accumulating power until I cannot tell the difference between serving the empire and controlling it. Vaelor moved beside her. Then we hold each other accountable. When I become too rigid, you force adaptation. When you accumulate too much control, I remind you why we started this. And if we both lose perspective, then the empire gets what it deserves. But at least we will have tried something different than endless repetition of the same mistakes. Seris felt exhaustion crash over her like a wave. The fear she had suppressed, the terror of assassination and betrayal and standing before hostile crowds demanding acceptance they refused to give. All of it hit at once. She sat down hard on the nearest chair. Vaelor knelt beside her. You are allowed to be afraid. I am terrified. Every day. Every moment. Afraid I will make mistakes that get people killed. Afraid I will become the villain while thinking I am the hero. Afraid that I am not strong enough for what we are trying to do. Vaelor took her hand. Good. Fear means you are paying attention. Only fools or tyrants govern without fear. He paused. I have spent years believing strength meant never showing vulnerability, never admitting doubt, never accepting that power has limits. His grip tightened. You taught me that survival sometimes requires changing everything you thought made you strong. Seris looked at him, at this man who had chosen her as bait and somehow found a partner instead, at this king who had built an empire through violence and was learning that violence alone could not sustain what it created, at this person who was as broken and terrified and determined as she was. We are going to fail sometimes, she said, constantly, but we will fail trying something new instead of repeating old failures. They sat together in the empty hall while torchlight cast shadows that danced like ghosts of every decision that had led them here. Outside, Astervale continued its endless performance. Inside, 2 people who had never expected to matter prepared to reshape an empire that had seemed eternal. The work would be brutal. The resistance would be constant. The possibility of failure was absolute. But for the first time since Vaelor had chosen a forgotten daughter from a dying house, both of them believed that failure was not inevitable, just possible. And possibility was enough to build on when certainty had proven to be illusion. Seris stood. Vaelor rose beside her. Together, they walked toward the throne. The Black Crown waited. Still magnificent, still dangerous, but no longer worshipped like something beyond human understanding. Just a tool, powerful but not divine, necessary but not sufficient. A symbol that could be reshaped same as the empire it represented. Seris reached out and touched the cold metal, felt the weight of history and expectation, and all the kings who had worn it while believing permanence was achievable through force alone. Then she withdrew her hand. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow we start changing everything." Vaelor nodded. "Tomorrow." They left the hall together. Behind them, the throne sat empty, waiting for rulers who understood that empires were not built to last forever. They were built to adapt or die. And adaptation required the one thing permanence could never tolerate: change. Fundamental, terrifying, absolutely necessary. The kind of change that transformed forgotten daughters into queens and tyrants, into partners and empires, into something that might actually deserve survival. Outside, snow began falling again across Aster Vale, clean and cold and covering everything in temporary beauty that would melt with morning sun. The empire breathed, the palace stood, and two people who had entered marriage as strangers prepared to rebuild a kingdom on foundations that had not yet been imagined. Because the real empire was not marble and gold. It was people choosing every day whether to perpetuate systems or dismantle them, whether to worship permanence or embrace transformation, whether to survive through fear or attempt something more dangerous. Hope. The first 3 weeks passed like walking through broken glass. Every council session became a battlefield where Seris fought for recognition that protocol refused to grant. Administrators questioned her decisions with elaborate courtesy that barely masked contempt. Military commanders tolerated her presence while directing actual questions toward Vaelor. She was visible but not yet valued, present but not yet powerful. The Empire watched with the patience of predators, waiting to see if wounded prey would survive or succumb. Seris spent mornings in strategy sessions learning military theory from generals who resented teaching a woman. Afternoons reviewing administrative procedures with bureaucrats who explained concepts slowly, as if intelligence was gendered. Evenings studying historical precedent and archives that documented centuries of male authority. The education was brutal, not because the material was difficult, because every lesson came wrapped in condescension she had to swallow without response. Vaelor watched it all with increasing frustration. One evening, he found her in the war room studying troop deployment maps until her eyes burned. "They're testing you," he said. "I know. You could demand respect. I would enforce it." Seris did not look up from the maps. Demanded respect is just fear wearing different costume. I need them to recognize competence, not obey threats. That could take years. Then I have years. She finally met his gaze. "You conquered through force. I have to conquer through proof. Different methods, same goal." Vaelor moved to the table and studied the maps she had been marking. "What are you working on?" "Contingency plans for northern border defense. The rebellion is crushed, but instability creates opportunity. If neighboring territories sense weakness, they might test our resolve." She pointed to several marked positions. "These garrison placements leave gaps in coverage. Reorganizing them increases defensive efficiency by 30% without requiring additional troops." Vaelor examined her work with the practiced eye of someone who had planned campaigns across half the known world. His expression shifted from skepticism to surprise to something else. "Respect. This is solid strategy, better than what General Corvin proposed last week." Seris felt warmth spread through her chest despite the exhaustion. "Then perhaps you should present it to the council as joint recommendation. They might actually listen if your authority backs the analysis." Vaelor's smile was brief but genuine. "No, you present it. Alone. And I will support your reasoning when they question it. That will make them angrier. Good. Anger reveals truth faster than politeness." The next council session became a crucible. Seris presented her northern border defense strategy with clinical precision. She anticipated objections, addressed concerns before they were voiced, supported every recommendation with historical precedent and mathematical analysis. General Corvin sat stone-faced throughout. When she finished, silence filled the chamber. Then Lord Ashmar spoke. His investigation had revealed financial irregularities, but nothing prosecutable. He remained on the council through bureaucratic protection Mordrin had built before exile. An interesting proposal, Your Grace, though perhaps overly ambitious for someone with limited military experience. The condescension was a blade wrapped in silk. Seris met his gaze without flinching. Limited experience did not prevent me from uncovering conspiracy that went unnoticed for years. I suspect it will not prevent me from recognizing defensive vulnerabilities either. Ashmar's face darkened. Conspiracy investigation and military strategy are entirely different disciplines. Both require seeing patterns others miss. Both demand understanding how systems function beneath surface appearance. And both suffer when pride prevents learning. The chamber tensed. General Corvin finally spoke. The Queen's analysis has merit. The garrison reorganization would indeed improve coverage. However, implementation would require coordination across multiple command structures. That complexity introduces risk. Seris turned to him. All change introduces risk, General. The question is whether maintaining current vulnerabilities is riskier than addressing them. Vaelor intervened smoothly. The Council will vote on the proposal. Those in favor of implementing the Queen's strategy signal assent. Hands rose slowly, not unanimous. But enough. The measure passed. Seris felt victory taste like copper in her mouth, not because she had won, because she had proven she could win without Vaelor fighting for her. After the session, General Corvin approached her privately. The old soldier's scarred face revealed decades of combat and harder decisions. That was well done, Your Grace. Your analysis was sound. He paused. But sound analysis is not enough. The northern territories are unstable. If your strategy fails, soldiers die. Can you live with that weight? Seris held his gaze. Can you, General? You have sent men to die for 30 years. How do you bear it? Corvin's expression softened slightly. By understanding that command means accepting consequences. Every decision carries cost. The question is whether you are willing to pay when the bill comes due. I already paid bills I never expected. Assassination, betrayal. Watching people die because I was too slow or too trusting. I'm still paying. She stepped closer. So yes, General, I can live with the weight, because the alternative is letting fear prevent necessary action. And I suspect you understand that better than most. Corvin studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Welcome to command, Your Grace. It only gets heavier from here. He walked away. Seris stood alone in the empty corridor, feeling the truth of his words settle like stone in her chest. But 3 days later, everything changed. The news arrived at dawn. Riots had erupted in the western provinces. Not rebellion. Civilian unrest triggered by food shortages and economic collapse following the Southern War. Merchants were being attacked. Government buildings burned. Local garrisons overwhelmed by sheer numbers of desperate people who had nothing left to lose. The council convened an emergency session. Vaelor stood before maps that showed the spreading chaos like infection through flesh. We need to deploy military force immediately. Restore order before this spreads to other territories. General Corvin agreed. 3 legions should be sufficient. Hard response. Public executions of riot leaders. Message that lawlessness will not be tolerated. Seris felt ice move through her veins. She spoke before thinking. No. The room went silent. Vaelor turned toward her. Explain. Seris moved to the map, pulse hammering. These are not rebels. They are civilians pushed beyond breaking point. They are starving, desperate. Sending legions to execute them will not restore order. It will create martyrs and guarantee future uprising. Lord Ashmar's voice dripped condescension. Then what does the Queen suggest? Negotiation with mobs? I suggest addressing the actual problem. Food distribution, economic support, showing them the Empire protects rather than only punishes. General Corvin shook his head. Soft response signals weakness. Weakness invites more chaos. Seris turned on him with sudden fury. Hard response against starving people signals tyranny. Tyranny creates the very instability you claim to prevent. She looked at Vaelor. You taught me that empires survive through adaptation. This is adaptation. Responding to civilian desperation with compassion instead of violence. Vaelor's expression was unreadable. Compassion costs time we do not have. Every day the riots continue. More territory destabilizes. Then we move fast. Emergency food relief, announced publicly, combined with limited military presence focused on protecting distribution rather than punishing protesters. The council erupted into argument. Voices overlapped, some supporting military response, others recognizing Seris's logic but fearing the precedent. Vaelor raised his hand. Silence fell. He looked at Seris with an expression that carried weight beyond this single decision. You are asking me to trust strategy that contradicts everything I know about maintaining control. I am asking you to trust that control maintained through fear alone eventually collapses. And when it does, the violence will make these riots look insignificant. Vaelor was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. We implement the Queen's strategy. Emergency relief combined with protective military presence. No executions without trial. No collective punishment. He looked at the assembled council. And if this fails, the responsibility is mine, not hers. The decision was made. Relief caravans were assembled. Soldiers deployed with orders to protect rather than suppress. Public announcements promised imperial support instead of imperial wrath. Seris worked 18-hour days coordinating logistics. She personally reviewed supply manifests, negotiated with merchant guilds for discounted grain, wrote speeches for local administrators emphasizing support over punishment. The work was exhausting and terrifying, because if it failed, people would die, and she would carry that weight forever. Captain Raiden became her constant shadow again. One night he found her in the logistics office, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. Your Grace, you need to sleep. I need to finish reviewing these distribution schedules. The schedules will still exist after you rest. Seris looked up at him. What if I am wrong, Captain? What if compassion is just naivety, and I am leading the Empire toward disaster? Raiden's scarred face softened. Then you fail trying something different. But I have served 3 kings, Your Grace, and I have never seen one willing to risk their authority on civilian welfare. That means something. What does it mean? That maybe the Empire is finally learning there are other ways to survive besides endless conquest and fear. He paused. The king chose you because he thought you were expendable. You proved you were essential. Now you are choosing a path he never would have taken alone. That is not naivety. That is evolution. Seris felt tears threaten but forced them back. Thank you, Captain. Sleep, Your Grace. The Empire will still be broken tomorrow. You can fix it then. 2 weeks later, the western provinces stabilized. The riots did not disappear completely. Anger and desperation ran too deep for immediate resolution. But the violence decreased. Protesters accepted food relief. Local leaders began negotiating rather than fighting. The strategy worked, not perfectly, but enough. The council reconvened to assess results. General Corvin stood and did something Seris had never witnessed. He bowed. To her. Your Grace, I was wrong. Civilian relief succeeded where military force would have created prolonged insurgency. You demonstrated strategic understanding I did not anticipate. The gesture rippled through the chamber. Other council members shifted, reconsidered, adjusted their assessment of this queen they had dismissed as decoration. Seris felt something fundamental change in the room. Not affection, respect. Earned through competence rather than demanded through authority. Lord Ashmar alone remained hostile. His voice cut through the moment like a blade seeking flesh. One success does not establish pattern. The queen gambled and happened to win. Governance requires consistency, not improvisation. Seris turned to him with the calm of someone who had stopped caring about his opinion. Governance requires adaptation, Lord Ashmar. You represent the old empire, the one that accumulated power through bureaucratic control while ignoring civilian suffering. That empire created the very instability you claim to prevent. She stepped closer. I represent something different, an empire that understands survival requires more than fear and permanence. And whether you accept that or not is irrelevant. The results speak louder than your resistance. Ashmar's face went purple. You overstep, Your Grace. You forget your position. No, you forget that my position changed. I am not decoration anymore. I am joint authority. And I am done pretending your approval matters. The chamber held its breath. Vaelor stood. Lord Ashmar, your investigation revealed financial irregularities sufficient to question your continued service. The only reason you remain on this council is bureaucratic protection I have tolerated out of stability concerns. He moved toward Ashmar with the contained violence of a storm gathering strength. But stability no longer requires tolerating corruption. You are removed from the council effective immediately. Your assets are frozen pending full audit. And if you resist, you will discover exactly how quickly tolerance becomes prosecution. Guards moved forward. Ashmar looked around desperately, seeking allies who had already abandoned him. This is tyranny. The council will not stand for this. Vaelor's smile was terrible. The council has already stood for far worse. Your removal is mercy compared to what others have faced. Ashmar was escorted out while protests died in his throat. The remaining council members sat in stunned silence. Vaelor returned to his seat. Anyone else have concerns about the Queen's position or authority? No one spoke. Good. Then we move forward with joint governance as established. The Empire is changing. Those who cannot adapt will be replaced by those who can. The session ended. But as nobles filed out, Seris felt something dark settle over the palace. Removing Ashmar was necessary, but it was also declaration. That she and Vaelor were willing to use force to protect their vision of reform. And declarations always invited response. The response came 3 nights later. Seris woke to the smell of smoke. She bolted upright, instincts screaming alarm. The corridors beyond her chambers glowed with orange light. Fire. Massive fire consuming the administrative wings. She grabbed a robe and ran into chaos. Servants screamed. Guards shouted orders. Nobles emerged from quarters in nightclothes. Confusion transforming into terror as they realized the scope. Half the palace was burning. Captain Rydan appeared through smoke, face blackened, breathing hard. Your Grace, we need to evacuate. The fire is spreading faster than we can contain. Where is the king? War room, coordinating response. He sent me to get you. They ran through corridors filling with smoke. Heat pressed against Seris's skin like something alive and hungry. Tapestries burned, wooden beams cracked, centuries of imperial history transforming into ash. They reached the war room where Vaelor directed firefighting efforts with military precision. He saw Seris and visible relief crossed his face. You're safe. For now. What happened? Arson. Multiple ignition points. Coordinated. Someone wants to destroy the palace or kill us in the attempt. Who? Vaelor's expression was carved from rage and calculation. Everyone we have damaged, every noble whose power we threatened, every administrator whose corruption we exposed. Take your pick. An explosion rocked the palace. Part of the eastern wing collapsed. General Corvin burst through the door. Your Majesty, the fire has reached the Treasury archives. If those records burn, we lose centuries of financial documentation. Can we save them? Not without risking lives. The wing is unstable. One more collapse, and anyone inside dies. Vaelor made the calculation instantly. Abandon it. Records can be reconstructed, lives cannot. But Seris understood what those archives contained. Evidence of Mordrin's networks. Documentation of noble corruption. Financial trails proving conspiracy. Everything they needed to continue reform. If those records burned, the investigation died with them. She turned and ran. Rydan shouted behind her, but she was already gone, moving through smoke-filled corridors toward the Treasury wing while her mind screamed that this was suicide. But survival sometimes required choosing between death and principle, and she was done surviving at the cost of everything that mattered. The Treasury wing was an inferno. Flames consumed walls. Ceiling beams sagged. Heat was physical force that pushed against her like hands trying to shove her back. Seris covered her mouth with fabric and pushed forward. The archive room sat behind reinforced doors designed to protect against theft, but not fire. She kicked them open. Inside, smoke billowed. Flames climbed shelves loaded with documents. Centuries of imperial records transforming into carbon and memory. She grabbed everything she could carry. Ledgers, correspondence, evidence collected over months of investigation. Her lungs burned, vision blurred, heat seared her skin. She turned to escape, and the doorway collapsed. Burning timber crashed down, blocking the exit. Seris stood trapped in a room filling with smoke and flame, arms full of documents that suddenly felt insignificant compared to the simple fact of being alive. This is how she would die. Not assassinated, not martyred, just burned alive trying to save paperwork. The absurdity almost made her laugh. Then the timber exploded outward. Vaelor crashed through wielding an axe like a weapon of war, armor smoking, face twisted with fury and fear. He grabbed her and dragged her toward the opening he had created. They ran through collapsing corridors while the palace died around them. Made it to an exterior courtyard where night air felt impossibly cool against burned skin. Seris collapsed, coughing smoke, still clutching documents. Vaelor knelt beside her, hands checking for injuries with desperate efficiency. "You could have died," she coughed again, throat raw. "The evidence. Had to save it. Evidence is worthless if you are dead." His voice cracked on the last word. Seris looked at him through smoke-blurred vision, saw fear there, real fear. Not for the Empire. For her. "I am sorry. Never apologize for surviving." He pulled her close, armor still hot from fire, heart hammering against her chest. Around them, the palace burned. Firefighting efforts continued, but the damage was catastrophic. Entire wings reduced to ruins. Historical chambers destroyed. Administrative records lost. The palace had been wounded in ways that would take years to repair, if it could be repaired at all. Dawn broke over Aster Vale, revealing the scope of destruction. The Imperial Palace, monument to permanence, stood gutted and smoking. Vaelor and Seris watched from the courtyard while servants and soldiers moved through wreckage, searching for survivors and counting the dead. 17 people had died. Servants trapped in collapsing sections. Guards who stayed too long trying to save others. Nobles overcome by smoke. 17 lives lost because someone wanted to destroy reform. Seris felt each death like a blade. "This is my fault," she said quietly. Vaelor looked at her. "Explain. If I had not pushed for change, if I had not challenged the council, if I had stayed invisible like they wanted, this would not have happened." Vaelor's laugh was harsh. "If you had stayed invisible, the Empire would have rotted from within until collapse was inevitable. This fire is not your fault. It is the cost of fighting systems built to resist change." He turned to face her fully. "People died tonight. More will die before this is finished. That is the brutal truth of governance. Every decision carries cost. Every reform creates enemies, and those enemies will fight with every weapon available." His expression hardened. "But we do not stop. We do not compromise. We do not let fear determine strategy. Because the alternative is surrendering to people who would rather burn the Empire than lose control." Seris looked at the smoking ruins. "What if we lose? What if the resistance is too strong and we destroy everything trying to save it? Then we rebuild from ash, same as we always have." General Corvin approached, covered in soot and blood. "Your Majesty, we found evidence of the arson, multiple accelerants, coordinated ignition, professional execution." He paused. "And we found the arsonist, dead, killed himself rather than face capture. But he carried this." Corvin handed Vaelor a sealed letter. The king read it. His face transformed into something ancient and terrible. He passed the letter to Seris without speaking. She read words that inverted her understanding of everything. The letter was addressed to the arsonist. Instructions for the attack. Payment confirmation. Signed by someone she recognized. Lady Corvin, one of the women who had allied with Seris, one of the nobles who had saved her life during the assassination attempt, one of the people she had trusted completely. Betrayal cut deeper than any blade. Because it meant the alliance had been compromised from the beginning. It meant Mira's conspiracy had not ended with her imprisonment. It meant the enemy was still inside the palace, wearing friendly faces while plotting destruction. Seris felt the world tilt. "Lady Corvin is under arrest?" she asked. General Corvin's expression was grim. "Lady Corvin is missing. Disappeared sometime during the fire. We are searching, but she had hours head start." Vaelor's voice was iron. "Find her. Use every resource, and when you do, bring her to me alive." Corvin saluted and left. Seris stood in the smoking courtyard holding evidence of betrayal while her mind raced through implications. If Corvin had been compromised, who else? How many of the women who allied with her were actually enemies? How deep did the conspiracy run? Vaelor's hand on her shoulder pulled her back from the edge of panic. "We survived this same way we survived everything else. One step forward, one enemy at a time, one decision made despite fear." Seris looked at him. At this king who had chosen her as bait and somehow found a partner in the chaos. At this man who had pulled her from fire at risk of his own life. At this person who kept choosing to stand beside her even when standing alone would be safer. Something fundamental shifted in her chest. Not gratitude, not obligation. Something more dangerous and more powerful. Recognition that what had begun as political necessity had transformed into something neither of them had planned. Trust, real trust. The kind built through shared danger and mutual survival. The kind that made losing each other more terrifying than any external threat. She reached up and touched his face. His hand covered hers. For a moment, they stood together while the palace smoked and the empire waited, and enemies circled like wolves sensing wounded prey. Then bells began ringing. Not fire bells, alarm bells. The kind that signaled attack. General Corvin ran back into the courtyard, face pale beneath soot. Your Majesty, the city gates. They are under assault. By who? An army. Marching under banners we do not recognize. Thousands of soldiers, professional formation, and they are demanding the palace surrender the false king and his treasonous queen. Seris felt ice flood her veins. This was not random violence. This was coordinated invasion timed to occur when the palace was weakest. The fire had not been isolated attack. It had been preparation. Vaelor's expression transformed into the warrior who had conquered provinces and crushed rebellions. Sound general alarm. Mobilize every available soldier. Fortify the inner city walls. He looked at Seris. This is what we feared. The resistance has moved beyond political opposition. They are attempting military coup. Who commands that army? We are about to find out. They moved to the palace walls overlooking Aster Vale. The city sprawled below, usually chaotic with commerce and civilian life, now transformed into battlefield. At the gates, an army assembled, professional, disciplined, too large to be simple mercenaries, flying banners that showed a crest Seris recognized with sickening clarity. House Mordrin. The Grand Chancellor had not gone quietly into exile after all. He had spent his exile preparing for war, and now he had returned to claim what he believed the Empire owed him. Control, absolute and eternal. Vaelor's jaw clenched. Mordrin played us. Exile was positioning. He knew we would weaken ourselves through reform, knew the palace would face resistance, knew the perfect moment to strike would be when we were most vulnerable. How did he raise an army this large? Gold. Promises. Every noble we threatened, every administrator we removed, every person who benefited from the old empire. He offered them restoration in exchange for support. Seris looked at the assembled force. Thousands of soldiers, professional equipment, siege weapons being positioned. This was not raid. This was conquest, and the palace was wounded, undermanned, unprepared. A messenger arrived running. Your Majesty, Lord Mordrin requests audience. He wishes to negotiate terms. Vaelor's laugh was bitter. Of course he does, because he thinks we have already lost. He looked at Seris. What do you counsel, Queen Regent? Seris studied the army below, studied the smoking palace behind them, studied the city caught between two forces preparing for battle, and made a decision that would determine everything. We negotiate, but not surrender. We buy time to assess strength and prepare defense. Buying time is delaying inevitable if we cannot actually defend. Then we make the inevitable costly enough that Mordrin reconsiders whether conquest is worth the price. How? By showing him that the empire he wants to reclaim no longer exists. That burning the palace and killing us will not restore the old order. That reform is already changed enough that going backward requires destroying the foundation he claims to protect. Vaelor studied her face. You have a plan, the beginning of one. Then let us hear what Mordrin has to say. And while he talks, we prepare for war. They met Mordrin under flag of truce at the city's central plaza. The Grand Chancellor arrived in full ceremonial robes, surrounded by armed guards, looking every inch the authority he had spent decades building. His smile was winter learning to speak. Your Majesty, Your Grace, such unfortunate circumstances. Vaelor's voice was carved from stone. State your terms. Mordrin gestured to the army assembled behind him. Abdicate immediately. Acknowledge that your reforms destabilize the empire beyond repair. Accept exile while I restore proper governance. And if we refuse? Then I take the palace by force. Many die. The city suffers, and the end result remains the same, except your legacy becomes tyranny that required military intervention rather than failure that accepted graceful retreat. Seris stepped forward. You claim to protect the empire, yet you bring foreign army to conquer its capital. That is not protection. That is treason. Mordrin's attention focused on her with intensity that felt physical. I bring restoration, Your Grace. The empire you and the king attempted to create is unsustainable. Joint rule. Civilian welfare prioritized over military strength. Administrative transparency. All lovely ideals that ignore human nature. He moved closer. People require authority, structure, the certainty that power will be exercised rather than debated. You offered compassion. I offer stability. History will judge which the empire needed. Vaelor's hand moved to his sword. History will judge you as traitor who burned the palace and attacked his own capital. Mordrin's smile never wavered. History is written by survivors, and I intend to survive while you become cautionary tale about kings who confuse sentiment with strength. He turned to address both of them. You have until dawn. Abdicate and live, resist and die. Choose wisely. He walked away surrounded by guards, confidence absolute. Seris and Vaelor returned to what remained of the palace war room. Maps were spread showing city defenses, troop counts, supply assessments, all of it revealing the same brutal truth. They were outnumbered 3-1. The palace was damaged, food supplies were limited, prolonged siege would end only one way. Defeat. General Corvin stood among the assembled commanders, face grim. Your Majesty, we can hold perhaps 3 days if we consolidate all forces at inner defenses. But without reinforcements, eventual outcome is certain. Can we call reinforcements? Not fast enough. Nearest loyal legions are weeks away. Mordrin chose his timing perfectly. Silence filled the room. Then Seris spoke. We do not need to win militarily. We need to win politically. Explain. Mordrin's army is mercenaries and disaffected nobles. They follow him because he promised restoration and payment. But loyalty purchased with gold is fragile. If we can break their certainty that conquest will succeed, the alliance fractures. How do we break that certainty when we are clearly losing? By changing what victory means. By making it clear that conquering the palace means destroying the empire itself. Vaelor looked at her with dawning understanding. You want to threaten the city. I want to make Mordrin choose between conquest and preservation. If taking the palace requires reducing Astervale to rubble, his supporters will reconsider whether restoration is worth the cost. General Corvin shook his head. That is desperate gambit, Your Grace. Threatening our own capital could turn civilians against us. We are already desperate, and civilians currently trapped between two armies understand desperation better than anyone. Seris moved to the map. We fortify inner city and palace both. Make clear that assault will require destroying civilian districts. Spread word that Mordrin's army brought destruction, not restoration. Force him to either accept negotiated settlement or reveal himself as conqueror willing to burn everything. The commanders exchanged glances. It was insane. It was desperate. It was the only strategy that had any chance of working. Vaelor made the decision. Implement the Queen's plan. Fortify positions. Prepare for siege. And make certain every person in Astervale understands what hangs in the balance. Orders were issued. Soldiers moved. The city transformed into fortress while night fell across the empire. In the darkness, Seris and Vaelor stood alone on the ruined palace walls. Below, torches marked Mordrin's army like constellations of hostile intent. We might die tomorrow, Vaelor said quietly. Probably. Any regrets? Seris thought about the path that had led here. From forgotten daughter to queen, from bait to partner, from invisibility to standing on walls defending an empire that had never wanted her. No regrets, only recognition that survival is not the same as living, and I would rather die fighting for something that matters than live serving people who see me as decoration. Vaelor turned to face her. Moonlight carved his features into angles and shadows. When I chose you, I thought I was selecting a tool, something expendable that could be sacrificed if necessary. I know, I was wrong about everything. You are not tool, not decoration, not expendable. His hand found hers in the darkness. You are the only person who made me believe the Empire could be something more than endless conquest and fear." Seris felt tears finally escape, despite years of forcing them back. "If we survive this," she said, "promise me something. Anything. Promise me we build an empire worth the cost. That all the death and sacrifice and brutal decisions lead somewhere better than where we started." Vaelor pulled her close. "I promise." They stood together while the city held its breath and armies prepared for battle, and dawn approached with the terrible certainty of judgment. And in the darkness before morning, two people who had entered marriage as strangers prepared to either save an empire or die trying to make it worthy of salvation. The first light broke across Aster Vale, revealing thousands of soldiers assembled for war. Mordrin's army stood ready, the palace defenders prepared, and between them, a city full of people who had never asked to become battlefield. Vaelor donned full battle armor. The black crown sat heavy on his head. He looked at Seris. She wore leather armor borrowed from the guard. The queen's circlet replaced by practical helm. No ceremony, no performance. Just two rulers preparing for the fight that would determine everything. "Are you ready?" Vaelor asked. No, but ready was never the point. They walked toward the walls where destiny waited, and the Empire held its breath, wondering whether the sun would set on salvation or ashes. Dawn broke across Aster Vale like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. The city held its breath between two forces prepared to destroy it in the name of saving it. Mordrin's army stood assembled in perfect formation, siege weapons positioned, mercenaries paid and ready. Behind palace walls, defenders numbered less than a third of the attacking force. Exhausted from fighting fires and carrying wounded and preparing for battle they knew would likely end in death. Seris stood on the ramparts beside Vaelor, watching the enemy arrange themselves with the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers who killed for gold rather than conviction. That was the weakness she intended to exploit. General Corvin approached carrying reports that confirmed what they already knew. 3 days of supplies, if rationed brutally. 2 days of ammunition for archers. 1 day of hope, if miracles were counted as tactical resources. "Your Majesty, the men are ready, but they understand the mathematics." Vaelor's voice was steady, despite the certainty of what approached. Mathematics change when desperation enters the equation. Men fighting for survival are worth 3 times their number fighting for payment. Corvin nodded, but his eyes carried the truth that generals learned through decades of watching soldiers die for causes that rarely mattered as much as the dying itself. He left to finalize defensive positions. Seris watched Mordrin's banner catch morning wind. The crest she had studied in archives, a family that had spent generations building power through patience and now prepared to seize it through violence because patience had finally expired. "There is another option," she said quietly. Vaelor looked at her. "Explain." "I challenge Mordrin to single combat. Ancient precedent, settling disputes through champions rather than armies. If I win, his forces withdraw. If he wins, you abdicate and accept exile. That is suicide. Mordrin is not a warrior, but he will choose a champion who will kill you in seconds. Probably. But it buys time. Makes him reveal strategy. Forces him to either accept or refuse in front of his entire army. And when you die, then you have gained hours to prepare better defense, and I have proven that the Empire is worth dying for. Sometimes symbolic gestures matter more than tactical victories." Vaelor grabbed her shoulders, fury and fear warring in his expression. "I did not pull you from burning archives to watch you throw yourself on blades for symbolic gesture. You pulled me from fire because you understand that some things are worth the cost. This is one of them." "No." His voice was absolute. Seris met his gaze without flinching. "Then what is your plan? Wait for them to assault walls? Watch the city burn while we delay inevitable? We are losing. The only question is how much we destroy before accepting that loss. There was a truth in warfare that distinguished competent commanders from great ones. Competent commanders fought battles they could win. Great commanders changed the battlefield itself so that winning became redefined. Vaelor had spent his life being great. Now he needed to be something more difficult. Wise. He turned away from her and looked at the city spreading below them. Aster Vale, heart of an empire built on conquest and fear and the accumulated weight of centuries, beautiful in dawn light, deadly beneath the surface, exactly like everything the empire represented. When he spoke again, his voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had finally recognized that strength alone was insufficient. You are right that we cannot win militarily, but you are wrong about sacrifice being the answer. Martyrdom creates symbols. We need solutions. Then what do you propose? I propose we give Mordrin exactly what he thinks he wants, and make him choke on it. Seris waited. Vaelor's smile was terrible and brilliant. We offer him the throne, publicly, in front of both armies. Announce that his concerns about instability are valid and that the Empire requires the kind of administrative expertise only he possesses. That is surrender. No, that is trap. Because Mordrin does not actually want the throne. He wants control without visibility. The throne makes him responsible, accountable. Every failure becomes his failure. Every uprising becomes his problem to solve. He paused. And we make certain that taking the throne requires him to accept every reform we implemented. Joint rule with you as Queen Regent, administrative transparency, civilian welfare prioritized, all of it. You think he will refuse? I think he will be forced to reveal that his crusade was never about stability. It was about returning to the old empire where he controlled everything while kings took blame for consequences. It was elegant in its brutality. Offer. Surrender. That was actually ultimatum. Force Mordrin to choose between accepting conditions he despised or revealing his true motives to an army that believed they fought for restoration rather than personal power. But it required trust that Seris struggled to offer after so much betrayal. What if he accepts? What if he takes the throne and simply executes us once he has legitimacy? Then we die having tried something different. But I do not think he accepts. I think he spent too long building shadow power to risk exposure that comes with wearing the crown. Seris studied his face, saw the calculation there. The strategic mind that had conquered territories and crushed rebellions, but also saw something else. Recognition that they had reached the point where survival required gambling everything on understanding human nature better than understanding warfare. She nodded slowly. Make the offer, but I deliver it. Queen to Chancellor. Make him refuse a woman in front of his entire army. Vaelor's expression shifted. That is cruel. That is effective. His forces include nobles who resent female authority, merchants who believe women belong in households, not throne rooms, soldiers who fight for traditional empire. Make him refuse my offer, and he reveals that his resistance is personal rather than principled. The plan solidified between them. Desperate. Dangerous. Entirely dependent on reading Mordrin correctly, but it was the only move left on a board where every other option led to slaughter. An hour later, Seris rode through the palace gates under flag of truce. She wore full royal regalia, the queen's circlet catching sunlight, silk robes embroidered with imperial crests. Every symbol of authority the empire had developed over centuries. Captain Ryden and 20 guards accompanied her, though all understood that if Mordrin chose violence, 20 guards were merely witnesses to assassination rather than prevention. The ride through Astervale's streets was silence broken only by hoofbeats on stone. Civilians watched from windows and doorways, faces carrying the exhaustion of people trapped between forces that cared nothing for their survival. Seris felt their eyes like weight. These were the people she had tried to help with food relief and reform. The people who would die first when armies clashed. The people who had never asked to become symbols in conflicts over power and principle. She thought about the fundamental arrogance of governance, how rulers made decisions that cascaded into civilian suffering while insulated from consequences by walls and guards, and the comfortable distance between authority and impact. If she survived this, she promised herself, that distance would shrink. Rulers would be forced to see the cost of their choices instead of reading about it in reports that transform death into statistics. They reached the plaza where Mordrin's army assembled. The Grand Chancellor sat on a throne he had constructed from borrowed furniture and imperial symbols, making himself look like authority before he possessed it. The performance was obvious but effective. His mercenaries filled the plaza. Thousands of armed men watching this woman approach, alone save for minimal escort. Seris dismounted and walked forward. Mordrin smiled like winter learning patience. Your Grace, I confess surprise at this delegation. I expected your husband to come beg for mercy. Seris stopped 10 feet from his makeshift throne. The king does not beg. Neither do I. I come with offer that serves the Empire better than violence. How generous. What does the false queen propose? Her voice carried across the plaza, pitched for the army to hear clearly. The king and I recognize that our reforms have created instability, that the Empire requires experienced administrative guidance, that Chancellor Mordrin possesses skills essential for reconstruction. Murmurs rippled through the assembled forces. Mordrin's eyes narrowed, but he maintained his pleasant expression. Continue. We offer you the throne, publicly, legitimately. Crown and authority transferred through proper ceremony. You become emperor. The civil war ends. The empire stabilizes under leadership you claim it requires. Silence fell across the plaza. Mordrin studied her face, searching for the trap he knew existed but could not yet identify. And what are the conditions of this generous offer? You accept every reform we implemented. Joint rule with myself as Queen Regent, maintaining equal authority. Administrative transparency, including public audit of all financial records. Civilian welfare prioritized in resource allocation. Regional assemblies given real power to check imperial authority. She stepped closer. You wanted control, Chancellor. I offer it to you. But control that comes with accountability. Visibility. The burden of actually governing instead of manipulating from shadows. Mordrin's mask cracked slightly. The assembled army watched their leader confronted with exactly what he had claimed to want. His response would reveal everything. He stood slowly, robes settling around him like royal garments, despite having no legitimate claim to wear them. Your Grace misunderstands. I do not seek the throne. I seek restoration of proper imperial function. The reforms you describe are precisely the instabilities that created current crisis. So you refuse the throne? I refuse the conditions that would make the throne meaningless. The Empire requires singular authority, not joint rule, not administrative transparency that paralyzes decision-making, not civilian welfare that weakens military strength. His voice hardened. I fight to restore the Empire that endured for centuries before your husband confused sentiment with governance. Seris let the words hang in the air. Let the army hear their leader refuse the very power he claimed to fight for. Let the soldiers recognize that restoration was just rhetoric disguising personal ambition. She turned to address the assembled forces directly. You heard your commander. Offered the throne with legitimate authority, he refuses. Because this was never about serving the Empire. It was about controlling it without responsibility. He wants power without accountability. Authority without visibility. The ability to manipulate while others bear consequences. Soldiers shifted. Whispers spread. Doubt was a crack in certainty, and cracks could be widened. Mordrin's voice cut through the murmuring with surgical precision. The Queen attempts manipulation through clever words, but words changed nothing. The Empire is broken. Your king broke it through weakness disguised as compassion. I offer strength, proven governance. Return to stability that served generations. Then prove it, Seris said. Accept the throne with conditions. Show that you can govern in daylight instead of shadows. Or admit that you prefer control without risk of failure. Mordrin's expression went cold. I admit nothing except that negotiation has failed. He gestured to his commanders. Prepare for assault. The palace falls by nightfall. The false king and his treasonous queen will face justice. The Empire will be restored regardless of their desperate delays. Seris felt ice move through her veins but kept her voice steady. Then you choose war. And when history judges this moment, it will know that peace was offered and refused, that restoration was available and rejected, that you preferred violence to accountability. She turned to leave. Mordrin's voice stopped her. One more thing, Your Grace, your bodyguard Captain Ryden. He served me before he served your husband. Old loyalties run deep. Perhaps deeper than you imagine. Seris went very still, turned slowly. Ryden stood 10 feet behind her, scarred face unreadable. Their eyes met, and Seris saw confirmation that inverted everything she thought she understood. The captain who had protected her, who had become her shadow and shield, who had saved her life repeatedly, had been Mordrin's agent all along. Betrayal was a blade that cut deeper each time, because eventually there was nothing left except wounded flesh, and the certainty that trust was delusion performed by people too naive to recognize that everyone had prices and limits and breaking points. Ryden's voice emerged rough with something that might have been regret or might have been performance polished through years of deception. I am sorry, Your Grace. Truly. You were never supposed to matter. Seris felt the words like physical blows. How long? Since before the wedding. Mordrin positioned me close to the king years ago, waiting for the moment when proximity could be weaponized. And everything? The assassination attempts you prevented? The evidence you helped gather? All controlled. Mordrin wanted you alive long enough to become symbol of failed reform. Dead too early, and you become martyr. Alive and struggling, you become proof that change is impossible. The plaza was silent, save for wind moving through banners and the distant sound of the city breathing. Seris looked at this man she had trusted. Then she made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. She laughed. The sound was broken glass wrapped in exhaustion, and the terrible clarity that came from recognizing she had been playing a game where every piece belonged to the opponent. You are right, Captain. I was never supposed to matter. I was decoration, bait, political necessity without value. She stepped toward him, but something changed. I stopped accepting the role you all assigned, stopped being invisible, started fighting for something beyond survival. Her voice dropped, but carried across the plaza with strange intensity. And here is what you and Mordrin never understood. It does not matter that I was manipulated. Does not matter that alliances were compromised and trust was weaponized. Because the reforms still happened. The evidence still exists. The empire still changed. She turned to address the entire army. You are here because someone convinced you the old empire was better. That strength meant dominance and stability required fear. But I've seen that empire from inside, seen the corruption it created, the suffering it ignored, the way it consumed people while calling it necessity. Her voice rose. I am just a woman who was nobody, who became queen through political convenience, who survived assassination and betrayal and burning palaces, not because I was strong, but because I was desperate, and desperation teaches lessons that strength never learns. She looked at Mordrin. You can kill me. Kill the king. Burn every reform we implemented, but you cannot erase what has been proven. That compassion is not weakness. That accountability is not paralysis. That the empire can survive without worshiping fear is the only currency that matters. Silence, absolute. Then a soldier in the front ranks dropped his weapon. Just one man. Mercenary who had been paid to fight for restoration that was revealed as nothing except ambitious chancellor, refusing power because power came with responsibility. The weapon hit stone with a sound like a period ending a sentence. Another soldier followed. Then another. Not mass defection, but enough to fracture the certainty that had held the army together. Mordrin's voice cracked like a whip. Any man who abandons position will be executed for desertion. We fight for the empire. For stability, for everything that has endured for centuries. But the fractures were spreading. Soldiers looked at each other, at the woman standing alone delivering truth that made too much sense, at the chancellor refusing the throne while claiming to fight for imperial restoration. General Corvin's voice cut through the chaos. The queen speaks wisdom. I have served the empire for 30 years, fought for stability, killed for order. And I recognize now that the stability we worshipped was just another word for refusing to change, even when change was necessary. He stepped forward. I will not assault the palace, will not murder civilians to restore a system that was rotting from within. If that is desertion, execute me. But execute me for choosing empire over ambition. Other voices joined. Not all. Not even half. But enough that Mordrin's army began to fracture into factions arguing among themselves. The Grand Chancellor's face went pale with rage. This is mutiny. Treason. You're throwing away restoration for clever words from a woman who understands nothing, Seris interrupted with voice like iron wrapped in silk. I understand that empires built on fear eventually collapse. That control maintained through manipulation creates the very instability you claim to prevent. That restoration is just nostalgia for systems that benefited few while destroying many. She walked toward Mordrin's makeshift throne. You spent decades building power, patient, intelligent, completely convinced that you knew better than everyone how the empire should function. And you were not entirely wrong. Your administrative networks were remarkable. Your understanding of bureaucracy was genius. She stopped directly before him. But genius without accountability becomes tyranny. And tyranny eventually consumes everything, including the people who create it. Mordrin stood, abandoning his throne, abandoning pretense. His voice emerged cold and final. Then we end this now. No more negotiation, no more manipulation. Just force meeting force until one side breaks. He drew a blade, not a ceremonial weapon, a killer's tool carried by a man who had ordered deaths but never personally executed them. Until now. Seris did not move. Killing me proves nothing except that violence remains your only answer when words fail. Mordrin's smile was terrible. Violence is the only answer that endures. Everything else is just noise before the inevitable. He lunged. Seris had no weapon, no defense, just acceptance that some stands had to be made regardless of survival. The blade moved toward her throat. Then Raiden stepped between them, the captain who had betrayed her, the man who had served Mordrin for years, the soldier whose loyalty had been purchased long before Seris existed as anything except political convenience. He blocked the strike with his own body. Steel-pierced flesh. Raiden gasped but held position, blood spreading across his armor. Mordrin stared in shock. "Your Grace," Raiden said through gritted teeth. "Run!" Seris did not run. She caught the dying captain as he collapsed. "Why?" she asked. "Why betray your master now?" Raiden's scarred face twisted with pain and something else. "Because you made me remember why I became a soldier. Not for gold, not for power, for the belief that serving something larger than myself mattered." His hand found hers. "I am sorry. For everything. But at least this death means something." He went still. Seris knelt in the plaza, holding the body of a man who had betrayed her and saved her in the same breath. Around them, Mordrin's army stood frozen, watching their leader kill his own agent. Watching the queen refuse to run despite having no protection. Watching something shift that had nothing to do with tactics or strategy. Mordrin looked at his bloody blade, at the dead captain, at his fragmenting army, at the empire he had tried to save by controlling it so completely that he had forgotten the difference between service and possession. His voice emerged barely audible. This was not how it was supposed to end. Seris stood slowly, blood on her hands and robes. It never is. People plan for victory, prepare for triumph. But endings arrive wearing costumes we do not recognize. She looked at the assembled forces, at soldiers questioning why they fought, at nobles reconsidering whether restoration was worth the cost, at an empire balanced between two visions of what survival meant. "We can end this now," she said. "No more death, no more burning, just acknowledgement that both sides wanted the empire to survive and disagreed only about methods." Mordrin's laugh was broken. "You offer mercy? After everything? I offer recognition that you believed you served the empire. You were wrong about methods, wrong about what the empire needed. But intention matters even when execution fails." She extended her hand. "Exile still stands. Live comfortably away from power. Or continue fighting and watch everything you built collapse into blood and ash." Mordrin stared at her extended hand, at this woman who had been nothing, who had become everything he never anticipated, who offered mercy he did not deserve. His blade clattered to stone. He took her hand, and the battle that would have destroyed Aster Vale ended not with victory, but with exhausted recognition that continuation was more costly than compromise. The army stood down slowly, weapons lowered. Tension dissolved into confusion and relief, and the strange emptiness that followed when violence was prepared for but never delivered. Vaelor emerged from the palace gates with his remaining defenders. He walked through the dispersing crowds until he reached Seris, standing beside Raiden's body and Mordrin's abandoned throne. Their eyes met. And Seris saw something there beyond relief. Recognition that she had done what he could not. Ended war through understanding rather than force. His voice was quiet. "You saved the empire." "We saved it," she corrected. "Together, same as everything else." The days that followed were chaos managed through exhausted determination. Mordrin's forces were disbanded. Mercenaries paid final wages and sent away. Nobles who had supported the rebellion were given choice between accepting reform or accepting exile. Most chose acceptance, because exile was lonely and reform was merely uncomfortable. Mordrin himself departed under guard, headed for the eastern reaches where luxury waited but power did not. Before he left, he met with Seris one final time in chambers that had once been his office. The space was empty now, documents removed, furniture bare, just hollow rooms that had contained decades of accumulated authority. He looked old suddenly, diminished by failure. I underestimated you, he said, completely. Saw decoration and missed the steel underneath. Seris sat across from him. You underestimated what desperation teaches. You had power so long you forgot what it feels like to have nothing except choice between surrender and fighting. Mordrin's smile was sad. The Empire will struggle. Your reforms will face constant resistance. In 10 years, 20, 50, someone else will attempt what I attempted. Return to the old ways. Restore what they remember as stability, probably. But each attempt will be harder. Each restoration will face population that remembers there were other options. Change is not single battle. It is endless war where victory is measured in generations rather than moments. She paused. You taught me that, actually. Patience, long-term thinking, building systems that outlast individuals. I taught you to defeat me? You taught me that power without evolution becomes extinction. I just applied the lesson differently than you intended. Mordrin stood to leave. At the door, he turned back. One final observation, Your Grace. You saved the Empire by refusing to let it remain what it was. That makes you dangerous, not to enemies, to the Empire itself. She met his gaze. Good. Empires should fear becoming comfortable. Comfort breeds the very rot you spent your life enabling. He left. And Seris sat alone in empty chambers, thinking about the strange mathematics of survival. How betrayal and loyalty were often same action viewed from different angles. How strength and weakness traded places depending on context. How the woman who had been nobody was now feared by the very system she had fought to save. Winter settled over Aster Vale like forgiveness that arrived too late to matter, but early enough to appreciate. The palace was rebuilt slowly, not restored to previous glory, redesigned with intention. Chambers that had been restricted were open to administrative functions. Walls that had created separation were removed to increase transparency. The physical structure reflected philosophical shift. Authority was still concentrated, but no longer isolated. Power still existed, but was increasingly accountable. The reforms continued despite resistance and setbacks, and the endless grinding work of changing systems built over centuries. Seris worked alongside Vaelor as true partners now, not queen and king, not decoration and ruler, just two people trying to build something better from the ruins of what had nearly destroyed them. One evening, as snow fell across the city, they stood together in chambers that had once belonged to Mordrin. The space was different now. Maps covered walls, documents spread across tables, evidence of governance performed in daylight rather than shadows. You are exhausted, Vaelor said. We are both exhausted. This work never ends. No. But it matters. Seris looked at him, really looked, saw the changes that months of partnership had created. The way violence had been replaced by consideration. The way domination had been supplemented with collaboration. He had not become soft, but he had become human in ways that kingship usually prevented. Do you regret it? She asked. Choosing reform over stability? Every day. But I regret more the empire I inherited, the one built on fear and permanence and the belief that strength alone was sufficient. He moved beside her at the window. Below, Aster Vale glittered with lights that represented lives continuing despite empire-level chaos. People who woke and worked and loved and struggled regardless of which ruler claimed authority. The empire is not the palace, Vaelor said quietly. Not the throne, not the crown. It is those people. And serving them requires humility that conquest never teaches. When did you become philosopher? Seris's smile was genuine. When I married a woman who refused to accept that being queen meant being powerless. You forced me to reconsider everything I thought I understood. He took her hand. I chose you as bait. You became a partner. Now you are something more dangerous. What? The person I trust most in the world. And trust is terrifying for men trained to view everyone as either asset or threat. Seris leaned against him, exhaustion finally claiming space that adrenaline had occupied for months. Trust is terrifying for everyone, but it is also the only foundation that actually supports weight when pressure increases. They stood together while snow fell and the city breathed, and the empire continued its endless negotiation between survival and transformation. Months became years. The reforms deepened. Regional assemblies gained real authority. Administrative transparency became expectation rather than exception. Civilian welfare was prioritized not through sentiment, but through recognition that stable populations were strategic assets. Resistance continued. Some nobles refused to adapt and were replaced. Some administrators clung to old methods and were removed. Some territories tested imperial resolve and were reminded that reform did not equal weakness. But slowly, incrementally, the empire changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough that the next generation would inherit something different than endless repetition of conquest and fear. Seris became more than queen. She became symbol of possibility that power could be exercised without cruelty, that authority could be maintained without domination, that the empire could survive transformation instead of ossifying into permanence. Her influence spread beyond Aster Vale. Other territories began implementing similar reforms. Other rulers began questioning whether the old methods were sustainable or simply familiar. Change was contagious once someone proved it was possible. 5 years after the battle that never happened, Seris stood in the Hall of Suns addressing the assembled council. No longer the emergency gathering of desperate defenders. The proper imperial council restructured to include regional representatives and civilian advocates alongside traditional nobility and military commanders. She wore the queen's circlet, but also the confidence that came from earning authority rather than inheriting it. The empire has survived its transformation, she said, not through strength alone, not through fear, but through recognition that survival requires adaptation. She looked at faces that ranged from supportive to skeptical to openly hostile. Many of you opposed every reform, fought against transparency, resisted accountability, and you had legitimate concerns about stability and efficiency and whether change would create more problems than it solved. Pause. Some of your concerns were proven correct. Reform has been messy, slower than hoped, complicated by resistance and implementation challenges. She smiled. But it has also worked. Regional assemblies have identified local problems central authority missed. Administrative transparency has reduced corruption. Civilian welfare investments have created stability that military force alone never achieved. Lord Karth, one of the older nobles, stood. Your Grace, the Council acknowledges progress, but progress does not erase concern about precedent, joint rule, female authority, civilian input into governance. These departures from tradition create uncertainty about future. Seris met his gaze without hostility. Tradition is just history that stopped being questioned. Every tradition was once innovation that frightened people who preferred familiar patterns. She moved toward him. You ask about precedent. I ask about results. The empire is more stable now than when I became queen, more prosperous, more resilient. If that success came through departing from tradition, perhaps tradition required departure. Karth sat slowly. Another voice. Lady Thessa, a younger noble who had embraced reform. The question is not whether reform succeeded. The question is what happens when you and the king are no longer here to maintain it. Does reform survive or does the empire revert to comfortable patterns? Seris turned to Vaelor, who had been silent throughout. The king stood. His presence still commanded rooms despite years of partnership softening the edges of domination. The empire will survive because we have built systems rather than relying on individuals. The reforms are structural now, embedded into governance. Removing them would require dismantling mechanisms that people have learned to depend on. He paused. But Lady Thessa is correct that our deaths will test everything. Future rulers will face choice between maintaining reform or returning to old methods. We cannot control that choice. We can only provide foundation that makes reform the easier path. The session continued for hours. Debates about policy and implementation and the endless details of governance. But underlying it all was recognition that something fundamental had shifted. The empire had survived transformation, and survival created its own legitimacy. Later, after the council disbanded, Seris walked through palace gardens that had been rebuilt after the fire. New growth mixed with old. Flowers that had not existed before the burning bloomed alongside species that had survived centuries. Vaelor found her standing beneath trees that cast shadows like lace across stone paths. You are thinking, he said. Always thinking. Wondering if we did enough. If the empire will remember why reform mattered once we are gone. Vaelor moved beside her. We cannot control memory, cannot force future generations to value what we built. All we can do is create something worth remembering. Do you think we did? I think we survived what should have destroyed us, turned bait into partnership, transformed weakness into strength, built empire that serves people rather than only demanding service. He took her hand. That is enough. More than enough. Everything else is future that belongs to others. Seris leaned into him, feeling the weight of years and battles and endless decisions that had shaped them both into people they never expected to become. I was supposed to be nobody, she said quietly. Forgotten daughter from dying house. Political convenience, sacrifice if necessary. You were never supposed to matter. No. But I decided to matter anyway. And that decision changed everything. They stood together while gardens breathed around them and the palace continued its endless performance, and the empire negotiated between past and future with the desperate hope that evolution was possible. The final scene of their story was not dramatic. No battle, no betrayal, no climactic confrontation, just two people standing together having survived what survival cost and built what building required. Seris thought about the girl she had been, invisible, dismissed, overlooked by empire that measured value through wealth and armies and political leverage. She thought about the woman she had become, queen, partner, symbol of transformation that frightened and inspired in equal measure. The journey between those versions felt impossible and inevitable simultaneously, and she understood finally that survival was not about avoiding danger. It was about walking through fire and coming out changed but not destroyed. Stronger not because hardship made you invulnerable, but because it taught you that vulnerability was its own kind of strength. Vaelor interrupted her thoughts. What are you considering? Whether we were heroes or just desperate people who refused to accept defeat? Seris smiled. Does the distinction matter? Not really. History will decide what we were. We just have to live with what we did. And can you? Live with it? Seris considered the question with the honesty it deserved. The deaths, the betrayals, the brutal choices and compromises and moments where survival demanded sacrificing principles. Could she live with carrying that weight? Yes, she said finally. Because the alternative was watching the empire consume itself while I pretended powerlessness was virtue. They walked back toward the palace as evening settled across Aster Vale. Behind them, gardens continued growing, mixing old and new, survival and transformation, memory and possibility. The empire endured not because it was permanent, but because it had learned that permanence was illusion and adaptation was survival. The Black Crown still sat in its place of honor, still magnificent, still dangerous, but no longer worshipped as something beyond human understanding, just a tool, powerful but not divine, necessary but not sufficient, a symbol that could be reshaped same as the empire it represented. Seris and Vaelor stood before it one final time in this telling of their story. Two people who had entered marriage as strangers and become partners through fire and blood and the desperate mathematics of survival. You saved me, Vaelor said quietly. Not from enemies, from becoming the kind of king who mistakes domination for leadership. You saved me too. From accepting that being powerless was the only role available to women in empires built by men. They had both been right and wrong and learning and failing and trying again with the stubborn persistence of people who refused to accept that the way things were was the only way they could be. The empire would continue after them. Other rulers would make other choices. Some would maintain reform. Others would attempt restoration. The battle between evolution and nostalgia was eternal, but at least now there was precedent that change was possible, that empires could survive transformation, that strength and compassion were not opposites, but partners in the endless work of governance. Seris touched the Black Crown one final time, felt the cold metal, the weight of history, the accumulated expectations of everyone who had worn it while believing permanence was achievable through force alone. Then she withdrew her hand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new resistances, new choices between convenience and principle. But tonight, the empire breathed, the palace stood, and two people who had been nothing walked together through halls they had helped transform into something that might actually deserve survival. Because empires were not built to last forever. They were built to adapt or die. And adaptation required the one thing permanence could never tolerate. Change. Fundamental, terrifying, absolutely necessary. The kind that transformed forgotten daughters into queens and tyrants into partners and empires into something that might actually be worth the cost of maintaining. Outside, stars emerged across a sky that had witnessed countless empires rise and fall and rise again. The patterns were eternal even as the players changed, and somewhere between those stars and the stone beneath their feet, Seris and Vaelor had carved out meaning from chaos and purpose, from desperation and hope, from the brutal recognition that the only alternative to hope was surrender. They had chosen hope, despite everything, because of everything. And that choice echoed through the empire like ripples spreading across water, changing nothing immediately, but everything eventually. The way all meaningful change happened, one choice at a time, one person at a time, one moment of courage against fear that accumulated into transformation visible only when looking backward across years. The story ended not with triumphant declaration, but with quiet acknowledgement that survival was its own kind of victory, and partnership was its own kind of strength, and the Empire would continue its endless negotiation between what it had been and what it might become. Seris took Vaelor's hand. They walked toward chambers where sleep waited, and tomorrow gathered, and the future existed as possibility rather than certainty. Behind them, the Black Crown remained, still magnificent, still dangerous, but no longer the only thing that mattered in an empire that had finally learned that crowns were symbols and people were substance, and the difference between the two determined whether kingdoms endured or empires crumbled into dust and regret. The end was just another beginning wearing different clothes. And beginnings were what desperate people built when they refused to accept that endings were inevitable.